Flames licked at the night sky, turning darkness into a hellish glow. The small cabin at the edge of Riverstone was engulfed wooden beams cracking under the assault of the fire windows, shattering from the heat. Inside, smoke billowed through the single room, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs. Lillian Harper moved with desperate purpose, her nightgown clinging to her sweat-soaked skin. Her hands trembled as she pried up the loose floorboard beneath the small table where she and her son took their meals. The hidden compartment beneath was just large enough for a child. "Eli," she whispered, kneeling beside her son. The boy, barely 2 years old, stared up at her with wide blue eyes that reflected the dancing flames. His small body shook with fear, but he made no sound. Even at his tender age, he seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. "Listen to me, sweetheart." Lillian's voice cracked as she pressed a small cloth into his tiny hand. It was a simple piece of white fabric with Eli embroidered in blue thread, the first half of his full name, Elijah. "You need to hide here. Don't come out until everything is quiet. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, clutching the cloth to his chest. "Remember that Mama loves you," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Always." She helped him into the space beneath the floor, her movements gentle despite her urgency. Before closing the board, she reached for a small metal box hidden beneath a loose stone in the hearth and placed it beside him. "Keep this safe," she murmured. "It's important." The sound of boots on the porch made her freeze. Through the smoke and flames, she could make out a silhouette in the doorway, a man with a kerosene can still in hand. The firelight caught the gleam of metal at his waist. A gun. "Goodbye, my angel," Lillian whispered, closing the floorboard. She straightened, turning to face the intruder, her body positioned to shield the hiding place. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself mourned what was about to happen. The sound of a gunshot pierced the night, momentarily drowning out the roar of the flames. Beneath the floor, little Eli pressed his hands over his ears, tears streaming silently down his face as he clutched the embroidered cloth. Above him, the floorboards creaked and groaned as the fire consumed his world. Michigan, winter, 1892. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, blanketing the hills in thick, unforgiving snow. Wind howled through the trees, bending pine branches until they groaned under the weight of ice. The small cabin perched on the hillside stood defiant against nature's assault, a single square of golden light in a world gone white. Inside, Grace Preston sat by the fire, her nimble fingers working at a piece of knitting. The soft click of her needles provided a comforting counterpoint to the storm's fury. At 36, her face bore the gentle lines of someone who had known both joy and sorrow. Her brown hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. Every few minutes, she would glance toward the window, as if expecting someone, though no one could possibly navigate the treacherous roads tonight. Across the room, Joseph Preston hunched over his workbench, a jeweler's loupe fixed to his eye, as he examined the inner workings of an antique pocket watch. At 40, his beard was flecked with gray, his hands strong but precise from years of crafting and repairing timepieces. The small collection of tools before him gleamed in the firelight, each one placed with meticulous care. "Storm's getting worse," Grace observed, pausing in her work to listen to a particularly violent gust that rattled the shutters. Joseph grunted in acknowledgement, not looking up from the delicate gears beneath his fingers. "It'll pass by morning, I expect." The silence between them was comfortable, born of 17 years of marriage. Yet beneath it lay a current of something deeper, a shared grief that had settled into the corners of their lives like dust in an abandoned room. Their small cabin felt both cozy and empty at the same time, with spaces that should have been filled with laughter remaining still and quiet. Grace was about to suggest they retire for the night when she heard it, a sound so faint she might have imagined it. Not the howl of the wind or the crack of ice-laden branches, but something else, something human. She set her knitting aside, head tilted. "Joseph, did you hear that?" This time he looked up, brow furrowed. "Hear what?" Before she could answer, the sound came again, a small whimper barely audible above the storm. Grace was on her feet in an instant, moving toward the door. "Grace, wait," Joseph cautioned, setting down his tools. "It's probably just the wind." But Grace knew better. She'd spent too many nights listening for sounds that never came. The patter of small feet, the whispered call for Mama, in the darkness. She knew the difference between the voice of the wind and something else. Something living. She pulled open the heavy wooden door, and the full force of the blizzard rushed in, bringing with it a swirl of snowflakes that stung her face. At first she saw nothing but white fury. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she gasped. A child stood on their doorstep. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 years old, thin and trembling with snow piled around his legs, as if it wanted to claim him. His clothes were inadequate for the weather, a coat too large and worn thin at the elbows, one mitten missing from a small hand that had turned an alarming shade of red. His dark hair was frozen in clumps against his forehead, and his skin had taken on a bluish cast that made Grace's heart seize with fear. But it was his eyes that struck her most deeply, large blue and hollow, as if all hope had been drained away, leaving nothing but resignation. He looked at Grace, not with the desperation of someone seeking shelter, but with the empty gaze of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. In his half-frozen hand, he clutched a sodden piece of paper. "They told me," the boy said, his voice so soft Grace had to strain to hear it over the howling wind. "There was someone here who wanted a child." Come in quickly," Grace urged, reaching for the boy's arm. He flinched at her touch, but allowed himself to be guided inside. Joseph was already on his feet, moving toward them, with concern, etching deep lines around his mouth. "Good Lord," he muttered, taking in the child's condition. Without hesitation he strode to the fireplace and added another log, stoking the flames higher. Grace led the boy to the hearth, kneeling to remove his soaked boots. His socks were wet through his small toes, an alarming shade of white. "Joseph, fetch the woolen blanket from our bed," she instructed, her voice steady, despite the panic rising in her chest. Frostbite. The child could lose toes if they didn't warm him properly. As Joseph hurried to obey, Grace gently took the sodden paper from the boy's grip. "Let me see this, dear," she said softly. "What's your name?" The child swayed slightly on his feet, exhaustion evident in every line of his small body. "Eli," he answered, the word barely audible. "Eli," Grace repeated, as if testing the feel of it on her tongue. "I'm Grace, and that's my husband, Joseph. You're safe now." Joseph returned with the blanket, and together they wrapped it around the child's shoulders. Grace noted how the boy stood perfectly still during their ministrations, neither helping nor hindering, as if he were simply an object being moved about. It broke something inside her to see a child so passive, so accustomed to being handled without agency. Joseph took the damp paper from Grace, squinting at the blurred handwriting. "It's from Reverend Henderson in Pinewood," he said, frowning. "Says the boy is to be delivered to—" His voice trailed off as he read further, and Grace saw a flicker of understanding cross his face. "What is it?" she asked. Joseph glanced at the boy, then back at Grace. "There's been a mistake. This letter was meant for the Whitfield family over on the other side of the valley." They've been waiting to adopt a child." Grace looked at Eli, who stood watching them with those hollow blue eyes, seemingly unsurprised by this news. How many times she wondered had this child been passed from hand to hand, his fate decided by strangers. "How did you get here, Eli?" Joseph asked gently. "Did someone bring you?" "The coach left me at the crossroads," Eli replied, his voice still barely above a whisper. The driver pointed which way to go, said it wasn't far. Grace and Joseph exchanged horrified glances. The crossroads was nearly 2 miles away. In this blizzard, it was a miracle the child had survived the journey. "And who sent you from Pinewood?" Grace asked. "Reverend Henderson," Eli said. "He said the orphanage was full, said I was lucky, said there was a family wanting a boy." His voice remained flat, emotionless, as if reciting facts that held no personal meaning. Grace felt her throat tighten. The Reverend had sent this child alone into a blizzard, with nothing but inadequate clothing and a piece of paper bearing the wrong address. The negligence was breathtaking. Before she could respond, Eli swayed more pronouncedly, his eyes rolling back. Joseph lunged forward, catching the boy as his knees buckled. "He's burning up," Joseph said, pressing a hand to Eli's forehead. "Grace, he's got a fever." Grace sprang into action, her earlier medical training taking over. "Put him on the bed in the spare room," she instructed, already moving to gather herbs from her stores. "We need to get him warm, but gradually. Too much heat, too quickly, could harm his heart." As Joseph carried the unconscious child to the small room that had once been meant for a daughter, Grace felt a strange sense of purpose flood through her. For years this cabin had been too quiet, too empty. Now, suddenly, it was filled with urgency and need. Through the night, Grace sat beside Eli's bed, applying cool compresses to his forehead, when the fever raged, and tucking the blankets more securely around him when chills racked his small frame. Joseph brought her tea and sat with her for hours, his weathered face grave as they watched the child struggle against whatever illness had taken hold. In his delirium, Eli would sometimes cry out fragments of phrases that made little sense. "Don't come out," he would mutter. "Not until quiet." And once, most distressingly, "Man with the bottle, fire." Other times, he would hum fragments of a melody that Grace recognized as Amazing Grace, the notes trailing off into incoherent murmurs. Toward dawn, as the worst of the blizzard began to subside, Eli's fever finally broke. Grace, exhausted from her night's vigil, felt tears of relief prick her eyes as she brushed damp hair from the boy's forehead. He slept now, his breathing deep and regular, his small face peaceful for the first time since he'd appeared at their door. Joseph, who had dozed in the chair beside her, stirred and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You should rest," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "I want to be here when he wakes." Joseph studied her face for a long moment, then nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. This child had already been abandoned once to their doorstep. Neither of them would leave him to wake alone and confused in a strange place. As morning light began to filter through the curtains, casting the small room in a gentle glow, Grace watched the rise and fall of Eli's chest and made a silent promise. Whatever mistake had brought this child to their door, she would ensure he found safety here for as long as he needed it. 3 days passed before Eli was strong enough to leave his bed for more than a few minutes at a time. The fever had weakened him considerably, and Grace noticed how carefully he moved, as if conserving every ounce of energy. Throughout his recovery, he remained strangely silent, for a child his age, responding to questions with the fewest words possible, watching Grace and Joseph with wary eyes. On the 4th morning, Grace entered the spare room to find the bed already made, the blankets pulled tight with military precision. Eli stood beside it, fully dressed in the clean clothes Joseph had found for him. Old garments they'd kept, though neither spoke of why they had children's clothing in a childless home. "Good morning," Grace said, surprised. "You're up early?" Eli nodded, his thin shoulders squared as if preparing for inspection. "What work should I do?" he asked. The question caught Grace off guard. "Work? You don't need to work, Eli. You're still recovering." A flicker of confusion crossed the boy's face. "I have to earn my keep," he stated, as if reciting a lesson learned by heart. "That's the rule everywhere." Grace felt something in her chest constrict. What kind of life had this child known that he believed his worth was measured by his usefulness? She knelt down to his level, careful to move slowly, noting how he tensed at her proximity. "There are no such rules here," she said gently. "You need to rest and get better, that's all." Eli regarded her with suspicion, clearly not believing her words. "I can sweep," he offered. "And I'm good at washing dishes. I don't break things." The pride in his voice when speaking of these simple tasks no child should have to be proud of mastering, made Grace's eyes burn with unshed tears. She swallowed hard before responding. "Perhaps later, if you feel stronger. For now, let's have breakfast." In the kitchen, Joseph was already at the table, a piece of toast half-eaten before him as he studied a broken clock mechanism. He looked up when they entered, offering Eli a nod and a small smile. Grace noticed how the boy's eyes lingered on Joseph's tools, a spark of interest momentarily replacing the wariness in his gaze. "Do you like clocks?" Joseph asked, noticing the direction of Eli's attention. Eli shrugged one shoulder, a non-committal gesture that seemed designed to avoid giving offense. "Never seen inside one before," he admitted. Joseph pushed his plate aside and beckoned the boy closer. "Come see, then. This one's from the station master's office. Stopped working last week." Hesitantly, Eli approached, standing at a careful distance from Joseph's chair. Joseph pretended not to notice the caution, instead pointing out the various gears and springs that made up the clock's inner workings. "Every piece has a purpose," Joseph explained. "Even the smallest gear is essential. If one part fails, the whole system stops." Eli listened with surprising intensity, his eyes tracking Joseph's finger as it indicated each component. For the first time since his arrival, the boy seemed fully present, engaged, rather than simply enduring. Grace busied herself preparing breakfast, watching the interaction from the corner of her eye. Joseph rarely spoke this much, even to her. To see him making an effort with the boy warmed something long cold within her. As the days passed, Eli's health improved, though he remained thin and quieter than seemed natural for a child his age. Despite Grace's assurances that he needn't work, she would often find him engaged in small tasks, sweeping the floor, folding laundry, carefully dusting Joseph's clock collection. He moved through the cabin like a ghost, trying to be useful while remaining unnoticed. One evening, about a week after his arrival, Grace was preparing dinner, humming softly to herself as she chopped vegetables. The tune was "Amazing Grace," a hymn her mother had taught her long ago. Without thinking, she began to sing the words quietly. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." A small voice joined hers on the next line, so unexpected that Grace nearly dropped her knife. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." She turned to find Eli standing in the doorway, the words flowing from him with a confidence she hadn't seen before. When he realized she had stopped singing, he fell silent, looking uncertain. "You know that song?" Grace said, trying to mask her surprise. Eli nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "My mother sang it, every night before bed." His voice dropped to a whisper. "She called it The Angel's Song. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother, and Grace treaded carefully, not wanting to extinguish this small flame of openness. "It's a beautiful hymn," she said. "My mother taught it to me, too." Eli seemed to withdraw again, his momentary animation fading. "I don't remember much about her, just the song and her hair. It was dark like mine." He paused, then added so quietly Grace almost missed it. "And the fire. I remember the fire." Before Grace could respond, the front door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air, and Joseph returning from his workshop behind the house. The moment was lost as Eli retreated to his usual watchful silence. Later that night, after Eli had gone to bed, Grace recounted the conversation to Joseph as they sat by the fire. "He mentioned his mother and a fire," she said, her voice low to avoid being overheard. "I wonder what happened to his family." Joseph's face was grim in the firelight. "Nothing good, I'd wager. The Reverend's letter made no mention of parents, only that he was from the orphanage." Grace sighed, her hands restless in her lap. "He's so careful, Joseph. Yesterday he accidentally knocked over a cup of water, and the look on his face, he was terrified, as if he expected to be struck for such a small mistake." Joseph's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "Some folks shouldn't be allowed near children," he muttered. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Grace voiced the question that had been growing in her mind since the night Eli arrived. "What will we do when the weather clears? The roads will be passable soon, and the Whitfields will be expecting him." Joseph didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was measured. "We'll have to take him to them, I suppose. It's where he was meant to go." Grace nodded, though a heaviness settled in her chest at the thought. "They're good people, from what I've heard. Wealthy, at least. He'd have opportunities with them we couldn't provide." "Yes," Joseph agreed, but there was something in his tone that made Grace look up sharply. He was staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. "But money doesn't make a home." Grace reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. They sat like that until the fire burned low, neither speaking of the growing attachment they both felt toward the quiet boy sleeping in the room that had waited empty for so long. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the blizzard's fury spent at last. Sunlight sparkled off the pristine snow, transforming the landscape into a dazzling white expanse. From the kitchen window, Grace watched as Joseph showed Eli how to clear a path from the house to the workshop, both of them bundled against the bitter cold. Joseph handled the large shovel with practiced ease, while Eli struggled with a smaller one, his determination evident in the set of his small shoulders. Grace smiled at the sight, though the smile faded as she remembered their conversation from the previous night. The roads would be cleared soon. The time for decisions was approaching. Later, while Eli napped, still recovering his strength, Grace found Joseph in his workshop, bent over a particularly intricate clock movement. She paused in the doorway, taking in the familiar sight of his hunched shoulders, the absolute focus with which he approached his craft. "You're good with him," she said softly. Joseph looked up, momentarily disoriented, as he pulled himself from his concentration. "What's that?" "Eli," Grace clarified, stepping into the warmth of the small building. "You're good with him. This morning, teaching him to shovel. Yesterday, showing him the clock works." Joseph shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Boy needs to learn practical skills." Grace settled on a stool across from him, studying her husband's weathered face. After 17 years of marriage, she could read the subtle signs of distress he thought he concealed. The tightness around his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze. "What is it, Joseph? Something's been troubling you since Eli arrived." For a long moment, She thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with a heavy sigh, he set down his tools and rubbed a hand over his face. "I've seen him before," he said, finally the words emerging reluctantly. "The boy. I've seen him before." Grace stared uncomprehending. "What do you mean, where?" Joseph's eyes, when they met hers, were haunted. "5 years ago, I was delivering a clock to a customer in Riverstone. On the way back, I saw smoke, a cabin burning on the outskirts of town." He paused, the memory clearly painful. "I stopped, of course. Thought someone might need help. The place was already engulfed by the time I got there. I could hear—" He swallowed hard. "I could hear someone inside. A woman screaming." Grace's hand flew to her mouth, but she remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "I tried to get in through the door, but the heat was too intense. Went around to a window, broke it. That's when I heard another sound, not screaming, but a sort of whimpering, coming from beneath the floor." Joseph's hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he spoke. There was a loose floorboard, under it a small space, and in that space a child. A little boy, no more than 2 years old, half suffocated from smoke. "Eli?" Grace whispered, the pieces falling into place. Joseph nodded grimly. "I believe so. Those eyes, I've never forgotten those eyes. I pulled him out, got him clear of the cabin, but the woman, his mother, I assume, I couldn't reach her. The roof collapsed just as I got the boy out." "What did you do with him?" Grace asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Took him to the church in Riverstone," Joseph said, confirming her suspicion. "It was the only place I could think of. It was only months after we lost Sarah. I couldn't bring him home to you, not then. It would have broken you completely." Grace felt tears well in her eyes at the mention of their daughter. Their only child, taken by scarlet fever when she was just 4 years old. The wound, even after 5 years, remained raw. "I gave him to the pastor there, explained what happened," Joseph continued. "Never found out what became of him afterward. I tried not to think about it, to be honest. It was a difficult time. And now he's here," Grace said softly. "Of all the places he could have been sent, he came to us." "To the wrong address," Joseph corrected, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Grace reached across the workbench and took his calloused hand in hers. "I don't believe in coincidences, Joseph. Not like this. If it is the same boy, and I believe it is, then God has sent him back to us for a reason." Joseph looked down at their joined hands, his expression troubled. "I failed him once, Grace. I couldn't save his mother." "But you saved him," she insisted. "And now, perhaps we have a chance to do more." They sat in silence, the weight of Joseph's revelation settling between them. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow, the day already beginning to wane. "We should tell him," Grace said finally. "If he is the same child, he deserves to know that his mother didn't abandon him, that someone tried to save her." Joseph nodded slowly. "Yes, but carefully. He's already been through so much, and we don't know for certain it's him." "Those eyes," Grace said, echoing Joseph's earlier words. "You said yourself you've never forgotten those eyes." Joseph squeezed her hand once before releasing it and returning to his work, a signal that the conversation was over for now. But Grace could see that something had shifted in him, a burden shared, if not yet lightened. As she walked back to the house, Grace found herself looking up at the clear winter sky, a prayer forming in her heart. If this child had been brought to them, by mistake, by providence, or by some combination of the two, She would not fail him. Not this time. Inside, she found Eli awake, sitting at the kitchen table with one of Joseph's old timepieces before him. He wasn't touching it, just studying it with intense concentration, as if trying to understand its secrets through observation alone. "Did you sleep well?" Grace asked, hanging her shawl by the door. Eli nodded, not looking up from the clock. "Is Mr. Preston a clockmaker?" he asked. "He is," Grace confirmed, pleased by the boy's curiosity. "One of the best in the county. People send for him from as far as Detroit sometimes." Eli considered this information, his small face serious. "It must be nice," he said finally, "to make something that tells people when it's time for things, so they don't miss what's important." The simple observation, spoken in a child's voice, but with an adult's melancholy, caught Grace off guard. Before she could respond, Eli looked up at her, his blue eyes intense. "I had a dream about the fire," he said abruptly. "There was a man with a bottle. He poured it all around, and then everything was burning." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. She sat down across from Eli, keeping her voice gentle. "What else do you remember about the fire, Eli?" The boy's gaze dropped back to the clock. "My mother put me under the floor, told me to be quiet, not to come out until everything was silent." His fingers traced the clock's outline without touching it. "Then there was a loud noise, like thunder, but sharper, and smoke, so much smoke." Grace's heart ached for the trauma this child had endured. "What happened next?" she prompted softly, Eli's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. "Someone came. Not the man with the bottle. Someone else. He broke a window. There was fresh air, and then—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't remember after that. Just waking up somewhere else with people I didn't know." A foster home, Grace surmised, or perhaps the orphanage itself. How many times had this child been moved since that terrible night? How many strangers had he been expected to call family? She wanted to tell him then that Joseph had been the one to pull him from the fire, that by some miracle he had found his way back to them. But she held back, remembering Joseph's caution. They needed to be certain, and they needed to be careful. Eli had endured enough trauma without them adding to his confusion. Instead, she laid her hand on the table, palm up. An offer, not a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Eli placed his small hand in hers. His touch was light, ready to withdraw at the first sign of threat, but it was contact, freely given. Grace counted it as progress. "You're safe here, Eli," she said, meaning every word. "For as long as you're with us, you're safe." The boy nodded, his expression guarded, but no longer quite so hollow. Outside, the sun began to set, casting the snow-covered world in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, something fragile was taking root. Not quite trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. 2 weeks passed in a gentle rhythm. Each day Eli grew stronger, the color returning to his cheeks, his periods of quiet watchfulness occasionally broken by moments of genuine curiosity, or even rarely a small smile. He still insisted on helping with chores, but Grace noticed he no longer approached these tasks with the desperate anxiety of someone trying to earn his keep. There was almost a pleasure in his diligence now, a sense of belonging that came from contributing to the household. Joseph had begun teaching him the basics of clock repair, starting with simple cleaning techniques and the names of various tools. The boy showed a surprising aptitude for the delicate work, his small fingers nimble, and his focus unwavering. In these moments, bent together over Joseph's workbench, the man and boy seemed to find a wordless understanding, a shared language of gears and springs that required no painful discussions of the past. Grace, watching them from the doorway of the workshop one afternoon, felt a fullness in her heart that had been absent for too long. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. It had become once again a home. But she knew their borrowed time was running short. The roads had been clear for days now, and they could no longer pretend that Eli's presence was merely a temporary arrangement necessitated by the blizzard. Sooner or later, someone would come looking for the boy who had been sent to the wrong address. That morning arrived sooner than she had hoped. Grace was teaching Eli how to make apple dumplings, his small hands covered in flour, as he carefully folded the dough around the fruit, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Through the kitchen window she saw a smartly dressed man on horseback making his way up the path Joseph had kept clear of snow. "Who is that?" Eli asked, a note of apprehension in his voice. "I don't know," Grace answered honestly, though dread pooled in her stomach. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Keep working on those dumplings. I'll see what he wants." She opened the front door just as the visitor dismounted. He was a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and spectacles that glinted in the winter sunlight. His clothes marked him as someone of means, or at least someone who worked for those with means. "Mrs. Preston?" he inquired, removing his hat with a polite nod. "Yes," Grace confirmed, not inviting him in. "How can I help you?" "Edgar Winters from the Pinewood Child Welfare Agency." The man introduced himself, producing a card which he handed to Grace. "I've come about the boy, Eli Harper. I understand he was mistakenly delivered to your home during the recent blizzard." So it had come, the moment they had been dreading. Grace felt a tightness in her chest but kept her expression neutral. "Yes, that's correct. He arrived in quite a state, half frozen and ill with fever. We've been caring for him until he recovered his strength." "That was very kind of you," Winters said, his tone suggesting that kindness was now expected to give way to practicality. "I'm here to collect him and deliver him to his intended placement with the Whitfield family. They've been quite concerned about the delay." Grace hesitated, torn between the impulse to close the door in the man's face and the knowledge that she had no legal right to keep Eli. "Won't you come in, Mr. Winters? The boy is just helping me with some baking. Perhaps we could discuss this over tea." A delaying tactic, and from Winters' expression he knew it. Nevertheless, he inclined his head. "Thank you, Mrs. Preston. That would be acceptable." As she led him into the cabin, Grace caught sight of Joseph emerging from his workshop, alerted by the visitor's arrival. Their eyes met across the yard, a wordless message passing between them. Joseph's shoulders straightened as he changed course to join them inside. In the kitchen, Eli had abandoned the dumplings' flour, still dusting his hands, as he stood rigidly by the table, eyes wide with recognition as they fell on Edgar Winters. "Hello, Eli," Winters said, his tone gentler than it had been with Grace. "Do you remember me from the orphanage?" Eli nodded once, his face carefully blank, though Grace could see the tension in his small frame. "Yes, sir." Joseph entered, and Grace made quick introductions. As she busied herself preparing tea, she watched from the corner of her eye as Joseph assessed the visitor, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Mr. Winters was just explaining that he's come to take Eli to the Whitfield family," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I see," Joseph replied, settling into a chair at the table. "And may I ask why it's taken 2 weeks for anyone to check on the boy's whereabouts? The roads have been clear for days." A flash of discomfort crossed Winters' face. "There was some confusion in the records. The blizzard disrupted many of our usual procedures. It was only yesterday that we were able to confirm where the boy had been sent." "Confusion seems to be a common occurrence in your agency," Joseph observed dryly. "First sending a child to the wrong address in a blizzard, then losing track of him entirely." Winters bristled slightly. "These are unusual circumstances, Mr. Preston. I assure you the welfare of the children in our care is our highest priority. Is it? Joseph's voice remained calm, but Grace could hear the underlying steel. Then perhaps you can explain why Eli arrived at our door, half dead from cold, with nothing but a scrap of paper and clothes wholly inadequate for Winter. Winters cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I cannot speak to the specifics of his journey here. I was only tasked with locating the boy and bringing him to the Whitfields, who have completed all the necessary paperwork for his adoption. Throughout this exchange, Eli had remained absolutely still, his eyes moving between the adults, as if watching a dangerous game whose rules he didn't fully understand. Grace's heart ached at the resignation she saw in his posture. The look of a child who had learned that his fate was always in others' hands, never his own. She set a cup of tea before Winters, then moved to stand beside Eli, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The boy has been through a terrible ordeal, she said. Surely it would be best for him to remain in a place where he feels safe, and has begun to heal. Winters sipped his tea, regarding them over the rim of his cup. When he set it down, his expression had softened slightly. I understand your concern, Mrs. Preston. Truly, I do. But the Whitfields have been waiting for a child for over 2 years. They've prepared a home for Eli with advantages I'm sure you can appreciate. Education, financial security, social connections. Money isn't everything, Joseph said bluntly. No, Winters agreed, surprising them. It isn't, but it is something. Something many of our children have never known and desperately need. He paused, studying the Prestons with a gaze that seemed to see more than they'd intended to reveal. You seem like good people. I don't doubt you've cared for the boy well. But the decision isn't mine to make. The placement was approved months ago. Grace felt Eli trembling beneath her hand. She squeezed his shoulder gently, wishing she could shield him from this conversation, from the casual way these adults were deciding his future without once asking what he wanted. When would you take him? Joseph asked, his voice gruff. Today, ideally, Winters replied. The Whitfields are eager to welcome him into their home. Today? Grace couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. But he's only just recovered. His things aren't packed. He hasn't had time to— What things, Mrs. Preston? Winters interrupted gently. From what I understand, he arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back. It was true, of course. Everything Eli now had, the clean clothes, the small wooden horse Joseph had carved for him, the book of fairy tales Grace had found in the attic, had been given to him during his stay with them. They weren't truly his possessions, just borrowed comforts. At least give us until tomorrow, Joseph said, not quite a request. Let the boy have one more night in a place he knows to prepare himself. Winters considered this, then nodded reluctantly. Very well, I'll return tomorrow at noon, but I must insist there be no further delays. The Whitfields have been more than patient. As the man rose to leave, Eli finally spoke, his voice so quiet they all had to strain to hear him. Do I have to go? The simple question, asked without hope of a favorable answer, hung in the air between them. Winters looked down at the boy, and for a moment something like genuine regret crossed his features. I'm afraid so, Eli, he said, not unkindly. The Whitfields are good people. They'll give you a fine home. Eli nodded, accepting this verdict with the same quiet resignation with which he seemed to accept all the decisions made for him. But when his eyes met Grace's, she saw something there that broke her heart. Not anger or fear, but a deep, weary disappointment, as if a fragile hope had been extinguished. After Winters had gone, the three of them stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the half-prepared meal that no one now had any appetite to complete. Joseph was the first to break the silence. "We'll figure something out," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Grace looked at him sharply. "What can we do? You heard him. The decision's been made." "We could adopt him ourselves," Joseph suggested, the words coming out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for days. "Make a counter-offer to the agency." Hope flared briefly in Grace's chest, only to be extinguished by practical reality. "We've already tried that route, Joseph. After Sarah, the agency said we were too old, too isolated out here." "They wouldn't consider us then. Why would they now?" Joseph had no answer for that, and the silence stretched between them heavy with all the things they couldn't change. It was Eli who finally moved, walking quietly to the small room that had been his since his arrival. They heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of fabric, as he began to pack the few possessions he'd accumulated. Grace looked at Joseph, tears welling in her eyes. "We can't just let him go," she whispered. "Not again." Joseph's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek, as he stared out the window at the pristine snow, now marred by the tracks of Winters's horse. "I don't see that we have much choice," he said finally, the words clearly costing him. "But I'll ride into town this afternoon, talk to Reverend Henderson. Maybe there's something he can do." Grace nodded, clinging to this thin thread of hope. As Joseph donned his coat and left for the stables, she turned her attention to Eli, gathering her courage to face the child they had come to love, knowing she had no comfort to offer him but her presence in the time they had left. The county courthouse stood imposing against the winter sky, its red brick facade and white columns reminiscent of the Whitfield mansion, though with an air of public authority rather than private wealth. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, transforming the town into a landscape of white, broken only by the dark figures of people hurrying about their business. Inside the building hummed with quiet activity. Clerks shuffling papers, lawyers conferring in hushed tones, petitioners waiting anxiously on hard wooden benches. Joseph led his small family through the echoing hallway, Eli between him and Grace. The boy's hand clasped firmly in Grace's own. They had dressed in their finest clothes, Joseph in his one good suit, slightly outdated but meticulously brushed. Grace in her blue dress saved for church and special occasions. Eli in new trousers and a shirt Joseph had purchased specially for the hearing, wanting the boy to feel the dignity of proper attire. They found the designated courtroom and settled on a bench near the front, Joseph's eyes scanning the room for any sign of the mysterious Gregory Jenkins. Several other people were already present, a clerk arranging papers at a side table, 2 men in legal attire conferring quietly, and Edgar Winters from the Pinewood Child Welfare Agency, who acknowledged them with a solemn nod. "Are you nervous?" Grace asked Eli softly, noting how still he sat, his small face composed but pale. Eli shook his head, though the tightness of his grip on her hand belied the denial. "I just want it to be over," he whispered. Joseph understood that sentiment all too well. The waiting, the uncertainty, it wore on the spirit, in a way that even bad news sometimes didn't. At least with a decision, however painful, one could begin to adapt to find a path forward. This limbo of not knowing felt like being suspended over a chasm. The door at the rear of the courtroom opened and Sheriff Miller entered, followed by Judge Harrison in his formal robes. Everyone rose as the judge took his place at the bench, his silver hair and stern countenance giving him an air of implacable authority. "Be seated," he instructed, settling his spectacles on his nose as he surveyed the room. "We are here in the matter of the minor child, Eli Harper, currently in the temporary custody of Joseph and Grace Preston." As the judge spoke, the door opened again and 2 more men entered. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 40 years of age, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to respect. The second man was older, thin, and scholarly in appearance, with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, clearly a lawyer of some sort. Joseph felt Eli stiffen beside him. The boy's gaze fixed on the newcomer with an intensity that was almost physical. Without turning his head, Joseph placed a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through the small body. "Mr. Gregory Jenkins," Judge Harrison acknowledged, "and your counsel, Mr. Davis, I presume. Please be seated. We'll begin momentarily." As Jenkins and his lawyer took their places at a table opposite the Prestons, Joseph studied the man who claimed to be Eli's uncle. There was, he had to admit, a certain resemblance to Eli in the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes. But there was something else in Jenkins's face that gave Joseph pause. A hardness around the mouth, a calculation in the gaze that seemed at odds with the role of a concerned relative. Jenkins caught Joseph watching him and returned the gaze steadily, one eyebrow slightly raised, in what might have been challenge or merely acknowledgement. Then his eyes shifted to Eli, and his expression softened to one of apparent concern and recognition. "That's him," Joseph heard him murmur to his lawyer. "That's Lillian's boy." Eli pressed closer to Grace, his face averted now as if unwilling to meet the stranger's gaze. Joseph felt a surge of protective anger. Whatever Jenkins's claim might be, his sudden appearance after 5 years had clearly unsettled the child they had come to love as their own. Judge Harrison called the hearing to order, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "This is not a formal trial," he explained, "but rather an investigative proceeding to determine the proper placement of the minor child, Eli Harper. I will hear statements from all parties, examine evidence, and make a determination based on the best interests of the child." He turned first to Edgar Winters, instructing him to provide background on Eli's history since coming into the care of the Pinewood Agency. Winters rose, consulting a slim folder. "Eli Harper came to our attention approximately 5 years ago," he began. "He was delivered to the St. Agnes Orphanage in Riverstone following a fire that claimed his mother's life. The child was approximately 2 years old at the time, too young to provide reliable information about his background." Joseph noted that Winters made no mention of who had delivered Eli to the orphanage. Himself, in fact, though he had never learned the name of the pastor to whom he'd entrusted the boy. Over the subsequent years, Winters continued, Eli was placed with 3 different foster families, none of which proved to be permanent situations. He was transferred to our Pinewood facility 8 months ago when St. Agnes closed due to lack of funding. In December of this year, arrangements were made for his adoption by the Whitfield family, but due to adverse weather conditions and an administrative error, he was instead delivered to the Preston household. Judge Harrison peered over his spectacles. "And the Whitfields have since withdrawn their petition for adoption. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Winters confirmed. "We received written notice of their withdrawal 2 weeks ago. No specific reason was provided." "I see." The judge made a note before turning his attention to Jenkins and his lawyer. "Mr. Davis, please present your client's claim." The lawyer rose, his manner polished and professional. "Your Honor, my client, Gregory Jenkins, is the brother of Lillian Harper, the boy's deceased mother. Mr. Jenkins has been searching for his nephew since learning of his sister's tragic death 5 years ago. Due to his work as a railroad engineer, which required extensive travel, and the confusion following the fire, it has taken him until now to locate the child." Joseph felt a flicker of skepticism. 5 years seemed an extraordinarily long time, even accounting for the challenges described. "Mr. Jenkins can provide documentation confirming his relationship to Lillian Harper." Davis continued, approaching the bench with several papers. These include their birth certificates, showing they shared the same parents and correspondence between them prior to her death. Judge Harrison examined the documents carefully, his expression giving nothing away. "And what is your client's interest in the child beyond the blood relationship?" "My client wishes to provide his nephew with the stable home and family connection that is his birthright," Davis replied smoothly. "Mr. Jenkins has recently settled permanently in Chicago, where he has purchased a home and established himself in a management position with the railroad. He is financially secure and prepared to give the boy every advantage." The judge nodded, returning the documents. "Mr. Jenkins, would you care to speak for yourself? Tell us why you believe the boy should be placed in your custody." Jenkins rose, his manner grave and composed. "Your Honor, Lillian was my only sister. We were close as children, though life took us in different directions as adults. When I learned of her death, I was devastated, both by her loss and by the thought that her son, my only living relative, might be lost to me as well." His voice carried a convincing note of emotion, though Joseph noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've spent these years searching for him, following every lead, however faint. When I finally traced him to Pinewood, only to learn he'd been sent to yet another temporary home." He shook his head as if overcome. "I want to give him what he deserves: stability, education, opportunity. A connection to his mother's family. Memories of who she was." It was a compelling performance, Joseph had to admit. If he hadn't been watching Eli's reaction, the subtle stiffening the way the boy seemed to draw further into himself with each word, he might almost have believed it himself. Judge Harrison turned next to Joseph and Grace. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston, while you have no legal claim to the child, I understand you wish to be considered for his permanent placement. Please state your case." Joseph stood acutely aware of his limitations in this formal setting. He was no lawyer, had no polished words or legal arguments to present. He had only the truth, plain and unadorned. "Your Honor, my wife and I didn't set out to adopt Eli," he began honestly. "He came to us by chance, or perhaps by providence, during the worst blizzard in recent memory. He was half-frozen, ill with fever, and deeply traumatized by his experiences." Joseph glanced down at Eli, drawing strength from the boy's solemn gaze. "Over these past weeks, we've come to know him, his courage, his intelligence, his remarkable resilience in the face of hardship. We've watched him begin to heal, to trust, to hope again." He turned back to the judge, his voice steady. "I was the one who pulled Eli from the fire that killed his mother 5 years ago." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest visibly sharpened. "Explain, Mr. Preston." Joseph recounted the events of that night. The burning cabin, the woman's screams finding Eli hidden beneath the floorboards. "I couldn't save his mother." He finished, the old guilt resurfacing. "The roof collapsed before I could reach her. I took the boy to the church in Riverstone, not knowing what else to do. My wife and I, we had lost our own daughter to scarlet fever just months before. I didn't feel we could take on the care of another child then." "Yet you wish to do so now," the judge observed. "Yes, Your Honor. Losing Sarah nearly destroyed us. It took years to find our way back to each other, to rebuild our lives. We never expected another chance at parenthood." Joseph's voice roughened with emotion. "But Eli has brought light back into our home. We love him as our own. We're asking for the chance to give him the family he deserves, not one based on blood ties or legal obligation, but on genuine love and commitment." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Grace. "Mrs. Preston, do you have anything to add?" Grace stood, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Only this, Your Honor. Eli came to us broken in spirit, if not in body. Each day we've watched him grow stronger, not just physically, but in his ability to trust, to express himself, to believe that good things might last, to uproot him again, to send him to yet another strange place with people he doesn't know." She shook her head, tears threatening. "It would undo all the healing he's begun." The judge considered this, then directed his attention to Eli himself. "Young man, would you approach the bench, please?" Eli looked momentarily terrified, but he squared his small shoulders and walked forward, standing before the judge with quiet dignity. Joseph's heart swelled with pride at the boy's courage. "Eli," Judge Harrison said, his tone gentler than it had been with the adults, "I know this is difficult, but I'd like to ask you a few questions. You're not in any trouble, and there are no wrong answers. I just want to understand how you feel about all this. Can you do that for me?" Eli nodded, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture Joseph recognized as his way of controlling nervousness. "Do you remember Mr. Jenkins from before the fire?" the judge asked. Eli's gaze flickered briefly toward Jenkins before returning to the judge. "No, sir," he answered softly, but clearly. "I don't remember having an uncle." "That's understandable," the judge said. "You were very young, and the trauma of the fire may have affected your memories. Do you remember your mother?" A shadow of pain crossed Eli's face. "Some things. Her voice, the songs she sang. Her hair was dark like mine. She smelled like oranges." Jenkins shifted in his seat, a small movement that nevertheless caught Joseph's attention. Something about Eli's description seemed to have unsettled him. "And how do you feel about possibly going to live with Mr. Jenkins in Chicago?" the judge continued. Eli hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "I don't know him," he said finally. "He's a stranger to me." "And the Prestons? How do you feel about them?" For the first time, Eli's composure wavered slightly. "They saved me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Twice. Mr. Preston from the fire, and then both of them from the blizzard. They—" he swallowed hard. "They make me feel safe." Judge Harrison nodded, his expression softening further. "Thank you, Eli. You may return to your seat now." As Eli walked back, Joseph saw Jenkins watching the boy with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. There was something predatory in that gaze, something that had nothing to do with familial concern. The judge cleared his throat. "I'd like to take a brief recess to review the documentation provided. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As they filed out of the courtroom, Joseph kept a protective hand on Eli's shoulder, steering him and Grace toward a quiet corner of the hallway, away from Jenkins and his lawyer. But before they could retreat completely, Jenkins approached, his expression arranged in a mask of avuncular concern. "Eli," he said, smiling down at the boy, "you've grown so much. You look just like your mother." Eli pressed back against Joseph's legs, saying nothing, his face blank in the way Joseph had come to recognize as his defense against fear. "Mr. Jenkins," Joseph acknowledged coolly. "This is difficult enough for the boy without added pressure." Jenkins's smile didn't waver, though his eyes hardened slightly. "I'm merely trying to reconnect with my nephew, Mr. Preston. Surely you can't begrudge me that, given our blood ties." "Blood isn't the only thing that makes a family," Grace said quietly, echoing Joseph's words to Eli. "Perhaps not," Jenkins conceded, "but it is the first thing the law considers, Mrs. Preston, as I'm sure the judge will remind us shortly." With that parting shot, he turned and walked away, rejoining his lawyer near the courtroom doors. Joseph felt Eli trembling against him and crouched down to the boy's level. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Eli nodded, though his face was pale. "He's not my uncle," he whispered so only Joseph and Grace could hear. "I don't remember him, but I know he's not family." Joseph exchanged a glance with Grace, heartened by Eli's certainty, even as he worried about what would happen if the judge ruled otherwise. "We believe you," he assured the boy, "and whatever happens in there, we're not giving up. Remember that." Eli nodded again, some color returning to his face at this reassurance. They spent the remainder of the recess sitting together on a bench, Grace telling quiet stories of her childhood to distract Eli from the tension of waiting. Joseph, however, couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over him. Jenkins was confident, well prepared, and had the advantage of a blood relationship that courts traditionally favored. What did they have to counter such claims beyond their love for a boy who had come to them by chance? Yet as he watched Eli lean against Grace's side, relaxing slightly as she described the antics of a pet squirrel she'd had as a girl, Joseph felt a renewed determination. This child belonged with them. Somehow, they would find a way to prove it. When they reconvened, Judge Harrison's expression was thoughtful, his manner deliberate as he addressed the courtroom. "Having reviewed the documentation provided by Mr. Jenkins, I find his claim of relationship to the child to be substantiated by the available evidence," he announced. "However, given the unusual circumstances, the length of time that has passed since the child's mother's death, the child's lack of memory of Mr. Jenkins, and the attachment he has formed with the Preston family, I am reluctant to make an immediate determination." Joseph felt Grace's hand squeeze his own, hope flaring briefly at this reprieve. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I am ordering a further investigation into the circumstances of Lillian Harper's death and the subsequent dispersal of her son. Sheriff Miller will conduct this investigation with the cooperation of all parties present." He turned to Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins, while your blood relationship to the child is not in question, the court must be satisfied that placement with you would indeed and be in his best interest. I understand you have accommodations here in town." Jenkins nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've taken a room at the Palmer House." "Good. You will remain available for the duration of the investigation. I expect it will take no more than a week to gather the necessary information." Next, the judge addressed the Prestons. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston, the child will remain in your temporary custody during this period, with the understanding that no attempt will be made to remove him from the jurisdiction. Sheriff Miller will visit your home as part of his investigation." "Yes, Your Honor," Joseph agreed, relief washing through him at the knowledge that Eli would return home with them at least for now. "Mr. Winters," the judge continued, "I'll require access to all records pertaining to the child's placements since coming into your agency's care." Winters nodded his agreement, though he looked less than pleased at the prospect of having his agency's procedures scrutinized. "Very well," Judge Harrison concluded. "This hearing is adjourned until 1 week from today, at which time I will render a decision based on the findings of the investigation." As they left the courthouse, Joseph noticed Sheriff Miller deep in conversation with Jenkins and his lawyer. The sheriff's expression was professional, but guarded, suggesting he was taking the judge's instructions seriously and would not be easily swayed by Jenkins's evident charm. "What happens now?" Eli asked, as they walked back to their inn to collect their belongings for the journey home. "Now we go home," Grace told him, smiling despite the worry that still clouded her eyes. "And we help Sheriff Miller understand what's best for you." "And what is that?" Eli pressed his gaze, searching her face. Grace stopped walking, kneeling despite the snow to look Eli directly in the eye. "That's for you to decide, dear heart. Not me, not Joseph, not the judge or Mr. Jenkins. You. The simple declaration seemed to startle the boy. I get to choose. The judge will make the legal decision. Joseph clarified, not wanting to give false hope. But your wishes matter, Eli. They should matter. And Grace and I will do everything in our power to make sure they're heard. Eli considered this, his expression solemn beyond his years. I want to stay with you, he said, finally, the words emerging with quiet certainty. I want to be where I'm safe. The simple declaration, delivered without drama or calculation, struck Joseph to the heart. It was perhaps the first time Eli had openly expressed his desire to remain with them rather than merely accepting whatever fate adults decided for him. Then that's what we'll fight for, Joseph promised, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, whatever resources they had to marshal, they would not lose this child. Not again. The journey home was quieter than their trip to town had been, each of them processing the events of the hearing in their own way. Eli fell asleep against Grace's side, exhausted by the emotional strain of the day. Joseph drove steadily, his mind working through what they knew and what they needed to learn before the next hearing. Jenkins's claim of relationship seemed genuine, based on the judge's review of the documents. But something about the man still felt wrong to Joseph. The way he looked at Eli, the calculation behind his apparent concern, the convenience of his timing, appearing just as the Whitfields withdrew their claim. There were connections here that remained hidden threads that needed to be unraveled. They arrived home late in the afternoon to find Sheriff Miller already waiting for them, his horse tethered to their porch railing. The man rose as they approached, his weathered face serious but not unfriendly. Prestons, he greeted them. Hope you don't mind me getting started right away. Judge Harrison is keen to have this matter resolved quickly. Of course, Joseph agreed, helping Grace and a groggy Eli down from the carriage. Come inside. Grace will make coffee while Eli rests. Once the boy had been settled in his room, the adults gathered around the kitchen table. Sheriff Miller pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. I'll be direct, he said, looking between Joseph and Grace. Jenkins's claim seems solid on paper. Birth certificates match. He has letters from Lillian Harper that appear genuine, and there's a family resemblance that even I can see. We don't dispute that he may be related to Eli, Grace said carefully. But that doesn't mean he has Eli's best interests at heart. Miller nodded, acknowledging the point. What concerns you specifically about Jenkins? Joseph and Grace exchanged a glance, silently, debating how much to share of their suspicions. His timing, for one thing, Joseph finally said. 5 years is a long time to search for a missing nephew, especially when the child was in the state orphanage system, not hidden away somewhere. And there's his manner with Eli, Grace added. He speaks of family connection and blood ties, but he made no real attempt to connect with Eli as a person. He didn't ask what Eli likes, what he fears, what makes him happy. Those aren't the actions of someone who truly cares about a child's well-being. Miller made notes, his expression non-committal. Jenkins claims his work as a railroad engineer kept him traveling extensively, making a consistent search difficult. And as for his manner with the boy, some might argue that's simply unfamiliarity after a long separation. Perhaps, Joseph conceded, but there's something else, something about the fire itself. This caught the sheriff's attention. Go on. I was there that night, Joseph reminded him. I saw the cabin burning, heard the woman, Lillian, screaming inside. It wasn't just an accident. The intensity of the fire, how quickly it consumed everything. It felt deliberate. Miller's eyes sharpened. Are you suggesting arson murder? I'm saying it's worth investigating, Joseph replied carefully, especially given how convenient Lillian's death seems to have been for certain parties. "What parties?" the sheriff pressed. Joseph hesitated, aware he was stepping onto dangerous ground with little concrete evidence. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Miller studied him for a long moment, then made another note in his book. "The cabin site is about a day's ride from here near Riverstone. I'm heading there tomorrow to examine what's left and speak with any witnesses who might remember the incident." He glanced up at Joseph. "Given your first-hand knowledge of that night, it might be helpful if you came along." Joseph nodded, relieved at the sheriff's willingness to pursue this angle. "I'd be glad to." "What about Eli?" Grace asked, concern evident in her voice. "And Jenkins, will he be part of this investigation as well?" "Jenkins will be interviewed separately," Miller assured her. "As for the boy, I'll need to speak with him, yes, but sensitively. Perhaps tomorrow, while Joseph and I are away, if that's acceptable." Grace nodded, though Joseph could see her apprehension at having to manage this alone. "I'll prepare him," she agreed. After the sheriff had gone, promising to return at first light, Joseph found Eli awake in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, with the small wooden horse Joseph had carved for him clutched in his hands. "Sheriff Miller will be coming back tomorrow," Joseph explained gently, sitting beside the boy. "He wants to talk to you about your memories, and I'll be going with him to look at where the fire was." Eli nodded his fingers, working over the smooth wood of the toy. "To find evidence," he said, not a question. "Yes," Joseph confirmed, continually surprised by the boy's perceptiveness. "Evidence that might help us understand what really happened that night." Eli was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he looked up at Joseph, his blue eyes intense. "I remember something else," he said softly. "About the night of the fire. I didn't say it in court because I wasn't sure if it was real or just a bad dream." Joseph felt his heart quicken. "What do you remember, Eli?" "Before the fire," the boy said slowly, as if retrieving each memory with effort, "there was arguing. My mother and a man. She was afraid I could tell. She kept saying, 'You can't have it,' and 'I won't let you hurt him.'" "Did you see this man?" Joseph asked carefully. Eli shook his head. "I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard his voice. It was—" he hesitated, struggling for the words. "Cold, hard, like he was used to getting what he wanted. And then what happened? My mother came to my bed. She was crying. She said we had to hide something important, something dangerous people wanted. That's when she put me under the floor with the metal box." Eli's voice had dropped to a whisper. "She said to stay quiet, no matter what I heard. That someone would come for me when it was safe." Joseph felt a chill run through him at the boy's words. This was no simple house fire, no tragic accident. This was something far more sinister. "Eli, this is very important," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the urgency he felt. "Did you ever see what was in that metal box?" Eli nodded slowly. "Papers, and a small book like a diary. My mother wrote in it every night. She said it told the truth about bad people, and that's why they wanted to hurt us. Do you remember any names? Any details from the papers or the diary?" The boy's face scrunched with concentration, then fell in disappointment. "No, I'm sorry. I was too scared to look closely." "That's all right," Joseph assured him, placing a hand on his thin shoulder. "You've remembered a great deal already, and it helps us understand what might have happened. Do you think Mr. Jenkins was the man arguing with my mother?" Eli asked, his eyes wide with fear at the possibility. Joseph chose his words carefully. "I don't know, Eli, but I promise you this. We will find out the truth. And until we do, you're staying right here with us where you're safe." The boy nodded, some of the tension leaving his small frame at this reassurance. "Will you tell Sheriff Miller what I remembered?" "Yes," Joseph said. "If that's all right with you. It might be important." "It's all right," Eli agreed. "I want to help find the truth, too." Joseph smiled, feeling a surge of pride at the boy's courage. "Then that's what we'll do together. Now I think Grace has dinner nearly ready. Shall we go see if she needs help?" As they walked to the kitchen, Eli's hand slipped naturally into Joseph's larger one, a small gesture of trust that meant more to Joseph than any words could have expressed. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever battles they might face, he would not let this child down. Not dawn was just breaking when Joseph and Sheriff Miller set out for Riverstone, the early morning light casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. They rode in silence for the first hour, each man lost in his own thoughts. Joseph had shared Eli's additional memories with the sheriff the previous evening, and Miller had listened with growing concern, making detailed notes and asking careful questions to clarify points without leading the boy's recollections. "The child has a good memory for someone so young at the time," Miller observed, finally breaking the silence as they navigated a particularly narrow stretch of road. "Trauma does that sometimes," Joseph replied. "Burns certain details into the mind while blurring others." Miller nodded, his weathered face thoughtful beneath his hat. "I've been considering what the boy said about the argument, the man's voice. It adds weight to your suspicion that the fire wasn't accidental." "You believe him, then?" "I've interviewed enough witnesses in my time to recognize the difference between invention and genuine recall," the sheriff said. Eli wasn't making it up. "Whether his interpretation is accurate is another matter, but I believe he's reporting what he remembers truthfully." Joseph felt a surge of gratitude toward the lawman. Miller was taking this seriously, approaching the investigation with professional thoroughness rather than merely going through the motions to satisfy the judge. "What do we know about Lillian Harper?" Miller continued, "beyond being Eli's mother and Jenkins's purported sister?" "Very little," Joseph admitted. "She kept to herself according to what I've gathered. Lived in that isolated cabin with Eli, worked occasionally in town for extra money." "Doing what?" Joseph shrugged. "I'm not sure. I never met her before that night." Miller made a thoughtful sound. "And Jenkins? What's your read on him?" Joseph considered the question carefully. "He's confident, well-spoken, clearly has money and connections, but there's something calculated about him." When Eli mentioned his mother smelled like oranges, Jenkins reacted oddly, as if that detail surprised or disturbed him. "I noticed that too," Miller agreed. "A small thing, but telling. A real brother would likely know such details about his sister." They rode in silence for a while longer, the rhythmic sound of hooves on packed snow, the only noise in the winter stillness. Around midday, they reached the outskirts of Riverstone, a town somewhat larger than Pinewood, though still modest by city standards. "We'll stop at my colleague's office first," Miller decided. Sheriff Dawson would have handled the original investigation into the fire, such as it was. He might have records or recollections that could help us. Sheriff Dawson proved to be a corpulent man with rheumy eyes and a perpetual wheeze, clearly counting the days until retirement. His office was cluttered and smelled strongly of tobacco, the filing system apparently consisting of stacked papers in various precarious piles. "Harper fire," he repeated, squinting at Miller's inquiry. 5-6 years back, out on Ridge Road." "That's the one," Miller confirmed. "Woman died, child survived. I'm investigating on behalf of Judge Harrison regarding custody of the boy." Dawson scratched his stubbled chin. "Don't recall much of an investigation. Open and shut, it seemed. Stove fire caught the curtains, spread from there. Common enough tragedy." "Was arson considered Miller pressed. Arson. Dawson looked surprised. What for isolated cabin, poor woman, no insurance to speak of? Where's the motive? That's what we're trying to determine, Miller said patiently. Were there any witnesses? Anyone who reported seeing strangers in the area that night? Dawson heaved himself up from his desk with a grunt, shuffling to a cabinet in the corner. After rummaging through several drawers, he extracted a thin folder. Here's what we have. Not much, I'm afraid. Statement from the fellow who found the boy. That'd be you, I reckon, he added, glancing at Joseph. Report from the undertaker about the body. Few notes from interviews with neighbors, though there weren't many to speak of. Place was pretty isolated. Miller accepted the folder, scanning its meager contents with a frown. No mention of a metal box, documents, or a diary. Not that I recall, Dawson wheezed. Course we weren't looking for anything like that. Just trying to determine cause and collect the remains. Joseph suppressed a flare of anger at the casual dismissal of Lillian Harper's death. How many other tragedies had been similarly glossed over, filed away, and forgotten without proper investigation? What about the boy? Miller continued. Where was he taken after he was found? Church took him in initially, Dawson said. St. Mary's. Pastor Wilkins was still there then. Good man. He'd know more about what happened to the child after. They thanked Dawson for his time, though Joseph privately thought the man had provided little of value beyond confirming his own negligence. Outside, Miller seemed to share his assessment. Not much help there, the sheriff muttered, tucking the thin folder into his saddlebag. Let's check the church next, then head out to the cabin site before we lose the light. St. Mary's was a modest white clapboard building with a small rectory attached. The current pastor, a young man named Reverend Phillips, greeted them with interest when they explained their purpose. Pastor Wilkins retired 2 years ago, he informed them, moved to live with his daughter in Ohio. But I've maintained his records, and I remember him speaking of the Harper tragedy. It affected him deeply. He led them to a small office, retrieving a ledger from a shelf. Here we are, January 1887. Child delivered by J. I. Preston following fatal fire at Harper Cabin. Approximately 2 years of age, no known relatives. Placed temporarily with the church until arrangements could be made with the orphanage. Joseph leaned forward, reading over the pastor's shoulder. Is there any mention of personal effects? Items that came with the boy? Reverend Phillips scanned the entry. Just clothing badly smoke-damaged, and... He frowned, squinting at a faded notation. Something about a cloth with embroidery. Yes, Joseph confirmed, remembering. A piece of white fabric with his name, or part of it, embroidered in blue thread. Eli. His mother had made it for him. Ah, yes. It says the cloth was kept with the child's few possessions. Presumably, it would have gone with him to the orphanage. The pastor looked up. There's no mention of a metal box or documents if that's what you're looking for. Miller nodded, unsurprised. What about visitors? Anyone come asking about the boy in the days after the fire? Reverend Phillips returned to the ledger, turning a page. Nothing noted here, but... He hesitated. There is something. Not in the official record, but Pastor Wilkins mentioned it when he was training me. He said a well-dressed man came asking about survivors from the fire, very insistent. Wouldn't give his name, but left a substantial donation for the church. Pastor Wilkins found it odd enough to remember, though he never connected it to anything sinister. Joseph and Miller exchanged a meaningful glance. When was this? Miller asked. A day or two after the fire, from what I understand. And the man's description? The pastor shook his head apologetically. Pastor Wilkins didn't provide details beyond well-dressed and from out of town. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful. They thanked the Reverend and continued on their way, both men processing this new information. A wealthy stranger making inquiries immediately after the fire, Miller mused. Interesting timing. And leaving a donation, perhaps to encourage discretion about his visit, Joseph added, or to ensure preferential treatment if he returned, Miller suggested grimly. The site of the Harper cabin was several miles outside town, accessible only by a narrow track that wound through dense woodland before opening onto a small clearing. Little remained of the structure, just the stone chimney standing like a sentinel among the ruins and the rotting remnants of wooden beams half buried in snow and undergrowth. Nature had reclaimed much of the area in the 5 years since the fire saplings pushing up through what had once been a floor-wild rose bushes tangling among the debris. Joseph dismounted slowly, memories of that terrible night washing over him. The screams, the heat, the desperate search for survivors. Finding Eli small and terrified beneath the floorboards. The roof collapsing just as he emerged, with the child blocking any chance of reaching Lillian Harper. It was fully engulfed when I arrived, he told Miller, his voice rough with remembered horror. Flames shooting through the roof. I tried the door first, but it was too hot to approach. Went around to that window there, broke it with a rock. Miller nodded, making notes as Joseph spoke. And the woman? Where was she? Joseph pointed to what would have been the main room. There. I could hear her, but couldn't see through the smoke. When I found the loose floorboard and the space beneath, he swallowed hard. I thought at first the child might already be dead. He was so still, clutching that piece of cloth. But then he coughed and I pulled him out. I wanted to go back for her, but the roof started coming down. The sheriff moved carefully through the ruins, examining what remained with professional thoroughness. The boy said his mother hid him under the floor with the metal box. Can you show me where? Joseph oriented himself based on the chimney, then stepped carefully over charred beams to a spot near what would have been the center of the cabin. Here approximately. The floorboard was loose, easy to lift. Miller knelt, brushing away snow and debris to reveal the blackened remnants of the wooden floor. Most had rotted away after 5 years of exposure to the elements, but a few sections remained preserved by the char. A hiding place, he murmured. Prepared in advance, it seems. Your average cabin dweller doesn't create hidden compartments under the floor without reason. She was afraid of something, Joseph agreed. Or someone. They searched the area thoroughly, though with little expectation of finding anything significant after so much time had passed. The metal box, if it had survived the fire, was long gone, either destroyed in the collapse of the structure or removed by someone in the aftermath. As the winter sun began its early descent, casting long shadows across the clearing, Miller straightened from his examination of the chimney base. Found something, he said, holding up a small object. Joseph moved closer, squinting at what appeared to be a metal button tarnished and partially melted by the heat of the fire. From clothing. Not just any clothing, Miller said grimly. See the insignia? That's from a railroad uniform, executive level by the look of it. Joseph felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Jenkins claims to work for the railroad. Indeed he does. Miller pocketed the button carefully. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? They rode back to town in thoughtful silence, the implications of their discovery hanging between them. At Miller's suggestion, they stopped at the local newspaper office before it closed for the day. Newspapers keep records of everything, the sheriff explained as they entered the small building that housed the Riverstone Gazette. If there's a connection between Lillian Harper and the railroad, or between her and any prominent figures, there might be a mention. The editor, a thin man with ink-stained fingers named Simmons, was initially reluctant to allow them access to his archives, but Miller's badge and a brief explanation of their official investigation soon changed his mind. Fire victims, you say? 1887. Simmons led them to a back room stacked with bound volumes of past editions. Those would be in these volumes here. January, you said. He pulled down a heavy tome and laid it on a table, flipping through the pages with practiced efficiency. Here we are, January 15th, 1887. Tragic fire claims local woman. Not much of a story, I'm afraid. We were a smaller operation then, and isolated incidents didn't get the coverage they might have warranted. Joseph scanned the brief article, which essentially confirmed what they already knew. Lillian Harper, approximately 30 years of age, died in a cabin fire. Her young son was rescued by a passing traveler and taken to St. Mary's Church. No mention of suspicious circumstances or possible arson. Was there anything else about Lillian Harper in your paper? Miller asked. Before the fire, perhaps employment notices, social mentions, anything that might give us insight into her life. Simmons scratched his chin thoughtfully. Name does ring a bell now that you mention it. Let me check the index. He consulted a large ledger, running his finger down columns of neat handwriting. Here we are, Harper Lillian. 3 entries prior to the fire report. He retrieved another bound volume, this one from the previous year. October 1886, small mention in the society pages. Miss Lillian Harper, formerly secretary to Mr. Harold Whitfield of Whitfield Enterprises, has taken up residence in a cabin on Ridge Road. Joseph felt as if he had been struck. Whitfield, as in the Whitfield family from Pinewood. One and the same, Simmons confirmed. Harold Whitfield owns half the businesses in this part of the state, including significant interests in the railroad. Very powerful man. His family has been trying to adopt a child, from what I hear. Miller's expression had sharpened with interest. What else do you have on the connection between Harper and Whitfield? Simmons turned pages, finding the next entry. December 1886, classified advertisements. Miss Lillian Harper, experienced secretary, offers discreet transcription services for legal and personal documents. Satisfaction and confidentiality guaranteed. Not unusual for someone with her skills to freelance after leaving formal employment. And the third mention, Joseph pressed. Simmons located it, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read. This is interesting. January 10th, 1887, just days before the fire. Letter to the editor from Lillian Harper, never published. It's noted here as rejected due to potential libel concerns. Do you have the actual letter? Miller asked urgently. We keep all correspondence published or not, Simmons confirmed, moving to a filing cabinet in the corner. After some searching, he extracted a yellowed envelope. Here we are. I should note that as this was never published, sharing it now could be problematic from a legal standpoint. Miller fixed him with a stern gaze. This is an official investigation into a possible homicide, Mr. Simmons. The contents of that letter may be crucial evidence. Properly chastened, Simmons handed over the envelope. Miller opened it carefully, extracting a single sheet of paper covered in neat, feminine handwriting. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave. What does it say? Joseph asked, unable to contain his impatience. Instead of answering directly, Miller handed him the letter. Joseph read quickly, his heart pounding as the pieces began to fall into place. To the editor of the Riverstone Gazette, I write to you as a last resort, having exhausted all other avenues of justice. During my employment as personal secretary to Harold Whitfield, I became aware of serious criminal activities being conducted through his businesses, specifically the illegal transport of opium via his railroad connections in partnership with a man named Gregory Jenkins. I have documented evidence of these activities, including dates, quantities, and financial transactions, which I am prepared to submit to the proper authorities. However, I fear for my safety and that of my young son. Mr. Whitfield has made threats against us both since learning of my knowledge, and his associate Mr. Jenkins has been seen watching my home. If anything should happen to me, I beg you to ensure these facts are made public, and that my son is protected from these dangerous men. Lillian Harper. Joseph looked up from the letter, meeting Miller's grim gaze. Jenkins isn't her brother, he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He's Whitfield's criminal associate, the man she was afraid of. And the man who likely killed her, Miller added quietly. The metal box, Eli mentioned, would have contained her evidence against Whitfield and Jenkins. Evidence they've been searching for ever since. And now Jenkins has found Eli, Joseph said, horror washing through him. Not because he's family, but because the boy might remember where the evidence is hidden, or might recognize Jenkins as the man who argued with his mother the night of the fire. Miller was already gathering his things, his movements urgent. We need to get back to Pinewood immediately. Your wife and the boy could be in danger. Joseph didn't need to be told twice. His only thought now was reaching Grace and Eli before Jenkins could act on his sinister agenda. As they rushed from the newspaper office, mounting their horses for the long ride home, Joseph silently cursed himself for leaving them vulnerable. He could only pray they would arrive in time. Grace stood at the kitchen window watching the road for any sign of Joseph and Sheriff Miller's return. The day had stretched endlessly, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. She had tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Eli's sake, continuing his lessons and keeping him occupied with small tasks around the cabin, but her thoughts kept straying to what Joseph might be discovering in Riverstone. Sheriff Miller had returned briefly that morning to interview Eli, his manner gentle but thorough, as he asked the boy to recall what he could about the night of the fire and the metal box his mother had hidden with him. Eli had been brave, answering as best he could, though the strain of remembering clearly exhausted him. After the sheriff left, promising to return with Joseph by evening, Grace had insisted Eli rest, tucking him into bed despite the early hour. Now, as dusk approached, she found herself increasingly uneasy. Something about the stillness of the winter evening felt ominous, a tension in the air that raised the hairs on the back of her neck. She was about to check on Eli again when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn sharply toward the window. A rider was approaching, not from the direction of Riverstone where Joseph and the sheriff had gone, but from the town of Pinewood. As the figure drew closer, Grace felt her heart sink. It was Gregory Jenkins alone, and riding with purpose. She moved quickly to Eli's room, finding the boy awake and sitting up in bed as if he too had sensed the approaching danger. "Someone's coming," she said quietly. "Mr. Jenkins, I want you to stay here out of sight. Can you do that for me?" Eli nodded, his blue eyes wide but steady. "Is Mr. Preston coming back soon?" "I hope so," Grace said, wishing she could offer more certainty. "But until he does, we need to be careful. If anything happens, if you feel unsafe for any reason, I want you to run to the workshop and hide. There's a small cellar beneath the floorboards where Joseph keeps his valuable tools. You'll be safe there." The boy nodded again, the mention of hiding beneath floorboards clearly resonating with his memories of the fire. Grace squeezed his shoulder reassuringly, then went to meet their unwelcome visitor. Jenkins was dismounting when she opened the front door, his smile pleasant but his eyes cold as he greeted her. "Mrs. Preston, I hope I'm not intruding." "Mr. Jenkins," Grace acknowledged stiffly. "My husband isn't here at present." "So I gathered," Jenkins said smoothly. "I've just come from town where I learned he's accompanying Sheriff Miller to Riverstone. Quite the investigation they're conducting." There was something in his tone, a hint of mockery perhaps, or barely suppressed anger, that sent a shiver down Grace's spine. She remained in the doorway, blocking entrance to the cabin. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the fear churning in her stomach. Jenkins's smile widened slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. I was hoping to spend some time with my nephew. Get to know him a bit before the hearing resumes. Surely you wouldn't deny a boy time with his only blood relative. Judge Harrison ordered that Eli remain in our custody during the investigation, Grace reminded him. Any visits should be arranged through the court. A flash of irritation crossed Jenkins's face before his pleasant mask reasserted itself. Come now, Mrs. Preston. There's no need for such formality. I've ridden all this way in the cold. The least you could do is invite me in for a cup of coffee while I speak with the boy. Grace hesitated, torn between the instinct to keep this man as far from Eli as possible and the fear of what he might do if provoked. Jenkins was larger than her, stronger, and there was a dangerous quality to him that hadn't been apparent in the controlled environment of the courtroom. Eli is resting, she said finally. He's been unwell. Perhaps another time when my husband is present. Jenkins's facade of pleasantness slipped further, his mouth tightening into a hard line. I don't think you understand the situation, Mrs. Preston. I'm not asking permission. I have business with the boy that won't wait for your husband's return. He took a step toward the door, and Grace tensed, aware of her vulnerability, but determined to protect Eli at any cost. What business could you possibly have with a 7-year-old child that's so urgent? She challenged. That's between me and my nephew, Jenkins replied, his hand moving to rest casually on his coat pocket in a way that made Grace suspect he was armed. Now step aside. No, Grace said, straightening to her full height. I will not allow you to frighten that child. If you have legitimate business, you can return when Sheriff Miller is present. For a moment, Jenkins seemed taken aback by her defiance. Then his expression hardened into something truly frightening, the mask of civility dropping completely to reveal the predator beneath. I've wasted enough time with niceties, he growled, pushing past her into the cabin with enough force to make her stumble. Where is he? Where's the boy? Grace recovered her balance, placing herself between Jenkins and the hallway that led to Eli's room. Get out of my house, she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. You have no right to be here. Jenkins laughed a cold sound without humor. Rights. You want to talk about rights? That brat's mother stole something that belongs to my employer. Something valuable. The boy knows where it is, and I'm going to find out if I have to tear this place apart. Any doubts Grace might have harbored about Jenkins's true nature vanished with this admission. You're not his uncle, she said, the pieces falling into place. You're the man Lillian Harper was afraid of. The man who killed her. A flicker of surprise crossed Jenkins's face, quickly replaced by calculation. You've been busy, he observed. Or rather, your husband has. It doesn't matter. What matters is the evidence Lillian hid before she died. The boy is the key to finding it. There is no evidence here, Grace insisted. Eli was 2 years old when his mother died. He barely remembers her, let alone where she might have hidden something. He remembers more than you think, Jenkins countered, his gaze shifting past her to scan the cabin. Children absorb everything, even when they don't understand it. And I'm not leaving until I get what I came for. He moved suddenly, shoving Grace aside with enough force that she fell against the table pane, shooting through her hip. As she struggled to regain her footing, Jenkins strode down the hallway, calling out in a mockingly gentle voice, Eli, where are you, boy? Your uncle's here to see you. Grace grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and hurried after him, fear for Eli overriding her own pain. She found Jenkins in Eli's room, yanking open the small wardrobe, his movements increasingly frantic as he searched for the hiding child. He's not here, Jenkins snarled, turning to face her. "Where have you hidden him?" Grace said nothing, the skillet held before her like a shield. Jenkins's eyes narrowed as they fell on the makeshift weapon. "Don't be foolish, woman," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You're only making this harder on yourself. Tell me where the boy is, and I'll leave you unharmed." "You're a liar and a murderer," Grace replied steadily. "You killed his mother, and now you've come for him. I'll die before I let you near that child." Something dark and ugly flickered in Jenkins's eyes. "That can be arranged," he said, reaching into his coat to extract a revolver. "Last chance. Where is he?" The sight of the gun sent a wave of cold terror through Grace, but she held her ground, praying that Eli had followed her instructions and fled to the workshop. If she could keep Jenkins occupied, perhaps the boy could remain hidden until Joseph returned. "He's gone," she lied. "Joseph took him somewhere safe before leaving for Riverstone. They suspected you weren't who you claimed to be." Jenkins studied her face clearly, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. "You're lying," he decided. "The boy's here somewhere. And if you won't tell me voluntarily—" He raised the gun, and Grace braced herself for whatever might come next. But before Jenkins could act, a small voice came from the doorway behind him. "Leave her alone." Eli stood there, his slight frame trembling, but his jaw set in determination. In his hand, he clutched the small wooden horse Joseph had carved for him, holding it like a talisman. "Ah, there you are," Jenkins said, his tone switching instantly to false warmth as he turned to face the boy. "I've been looking for you, Eli. Your mother left something important with you, something I need to find. If you help me, I'll let you and Mrs. Preston go unharmed." Eli's gaze shifted to Grace, taking in her disheveled appearance and the fear she couldn't fully hide. Then he looked back at Jenkins, his blue eyes hardening with a recognition that seemed to startle the man. "I remember you," Eli said quietly. "You were the one arguing with my mother, the one who poured the liquid that smelled bad, the one who had the gun that night." Jenkins's expression flickered with surprise, then settled into cold calculation. "Smart boy," he acknowledged. "Too smart for your own good, just like your mother. Now where's the metal box she hid with you? Where are her papers?" "I don't know," Eli answered truthfully. "Someone took me away after the fire. I never saw the box again." Frustration twisted Jenkins's features. "Don't lie to me, boy. Your mother kept records of shipments, names, dates. Whitfield wants those records destroyed, and he's paying me well to make sure that happens." "I'm not lying," Eli insisted, his voice small but steady. "I don't have what you want." Jenkins raised the gun, pointing it directly at the child. "Perhaps you need motivation to remember." Grace moved without thinking, crossing the room in 2 strides to place herself between Eli and the weapon. "Run, Eli," she commanded, never taking her eyes off Jenkins. "Now—" The boy hesitated for only a moment before darting away, his footsteps receding down the hallway toward the front door. Jenkins cursed, shoving Grace aside once more as he pursued. She fell hard, her head striking the edge of the bed frame, pain exploding behind her eyes. Through the haze, she heard the front door slam, Jenkins's heavy footsteps on the porch. Then the sound of another horse approaching. "Please, God, let it be Joseph," she prayed silently as darkness threatened to overtake her. "Let him be in time." Outside, Eli ran through the snow toward the workshop, his breath coming in panicked gasps. The wooden horse was still clutched in his hand, a connection to Joseph and safety that he couldn't bear to release. Behind him, he could hear Jenkins's pursuit, the man's angry shouts growing closer with each second. The workshop door seemed impossibly far away. Eli pushed himself harder, his small legs floundering in the deep snow. Just a few more yards, and he could reach the hiding place Grace had described. The cellar beneath the floorboards, a familiar refuge that echoed his survival of the fire years before. He was halfway there when the sound of approaching horses made him pause and look back. Two riders were coming fast up the road. One on a black horse he recognized as Joseph's, the other in a sheriff's uniform. Relief flooded through him quickly, followed by renewed fear as he realized Jenkins had seen them too. The man had stopped his pursuit, turning to face the newcomers with the gun still in his hand. Eli should have continued running to safety, but something held him in place, a need to see what would happen, to witness the confrontation that might finally end the nightmare that had begun 5 years ago with his mother's death. Joseph and Sheriff Miller dismounted quickly, both drawing weapons as they approached. "Gregory Jenkins!" Miller called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold evening air. "Drop your weapon and put your hands where I can see them. You're under arrest for the murder of Lillian Harper." Jenkins didn't comply, his gun shifting to point at the approaching men. "You have nothing on me," he snarled. "No evidence, no witnesses." "We have her letter," Joseph replied, his voice steady despite the fear Eli could see in his face. "We know about the opium shipments, about your partnership with Whitfield. We know you killed her to silence her, and that you've been looking for her evidence ever since. And we have a witness," Miller added, gesturing toward Eli without taking his eyes off Jenkins. "A witness who remembers you from the night of the fire." Jenkins's gaze darted to Eli, cold calculation in his eyes. "The word of a child means nothing," he scoffed. "And you'll never find the evidence. It burned with her." "Then why are you here?" Joseph challenged. "Why come after Eli if the evidence is gone?" Something ugly twisted Jenkins's features. "Insurance," he spat. "The boy might remember more than is convenient. Whitfield doesn't like loose ends." "Put down the gun, Jenkins," Miller ordered again. "It's over." For a moment, it seemed Jenkins might comply. His shoulders sagged slightly, the fight going out of him. Then, with terrifying suddenness, he swung the weapon toward Eli, his intention clear in his eyes. "No!" Joseph shouted, lunging forward. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, echoing across the snow-covered yard. Jenkins staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face, as red blossomed on his shirt front. He fell to his knees, then toppled forward into the snow. Sheriff Miller moved quickly to the fallen man, kicking his weapon away before checking for signs of life. "He's done," he announced grimly, holstering his own gun. Joseph was already running toward Eli, gathering the boy into his arms with a desperation born of nearly losing him. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, checking the child for injuries. "Where's Grace?" "In the house." Eli managed, his voice shaking. "He pushed her. She fell." Joseph carried Eli swiftly toward the cabin, Miller following close behind. They found Grace just regaining consciousness, a nasty bruise forming on her temple. Joseph's relief at seeing her alive was palpable, his free arm going around her as he still held Eli close with the other. "It's over," he told them both, his voice rough with emotion. "Jenkins is dead. You're safe now." Grace leaned against him, her eyes filling with tears, as the danger and fear of the past hours caught up with her. "He wasn't Eli's uncle," she said. "He admitted it. He was after something Lillian Harper had hidden, some evidence against him and Whitfield." "We know," Joseph assured her. "We found her letter at the newspaper office in Riverstone. She was going to expose their opium smuggling operation. That's why they killed her." Sheriff Miller had been examining Grace's injury, his expression concerned. "This needs attention," he said. and we need to get statements from all of you while the events are fresh in your minds. But that can wait until morning. For now, you should rest." As Miller left to deal with Jenkins's body and send for the doctor, the small family clung to each other in the safety of their home. Eli remained nestled in Joseph's arms, his face buried against the man's shoulder, the wooden horse still clutched in his hand. "I was so scared," the boy admitted in a small voice. "I thought he was going to hurt Grace." "You were very brave," Joseph told him, his voice thick with pride and lingering fear. "Coming out to distract him to protect Grace. Braver than anyone should have to be, especially a child." Eli looked up, his blue eyes serious in his pale face. "I remembered him," he said, "from that night. His voice, the smell of the liquid he poured. I knew he was lying about being my uncle." Grace smoothed the boy's dark hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle, despite her own pain. "You saved us all with that memory, dear heart. Your mother would be so proud of you." Eli considered this, a small furrow appearing between his brows. Do you think she knew someone would come for me when she hid me under the floor?" "I'm sure she did," Joseph said softly. "Mothers always find a way to protect their children. She saved you then, and her courage helped save you now." The boy nodded, seeming to find comfort in this thought. As the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, his eyelids grew heavy, exhaustion claiming him despite his efforts to stay awake. "Sleep now," Grace murmured, seeing his struggle. "We'll be right here. You're safe." As Eli drifted into slumber, still held securely in Joseph's arms, the adults exchanged a look over his head, a look that contained all their fear relief and fierce determination to protect this child who had come to mean everything to them. The danger had passed, but they knew the battle wasn't over. There would be questions, investigations, perhaps even challenges from Whitfield himself, once he learned of Jenkins's failure. But for this moment in the quiet aftermath of violence, they were together. They were family, and they would face whatever came next with the strength that love provides. The week that followed was a blur of official statements, medical examinations, and legal proceedings. Sheriff Miller moved quickly to secure a warrant for Harold Whitfield's arrest based on the evidence they had uncovered, though the powerful businessman had fled before it could be served, taking with him whatever incriminating documents might have remained in his possession. Victoria Whitfield questioned about her husband's whereabouts, professed ignorance, while simultaneously distancing herself from his activities. It was she, it emerged, who had withdrawn their petition to adopt Eli after learning of her husband's connection to Lillian Harper's death. Not from any sense of justice, but from fear that the boy might eventually remember enough to implicate them both. "I knew nothing of the opium shipments," she insisted to Sheriff Miller, her elegant composure never slipping despite the scandal engulfing her household. "I simply felt it unwise to bring a child into our home who might harbor unfortunate memories." The murder weapon found at the Harper cabin site. The button from a railroad executive's uniform was matched to a coat in Whitfield's possession, providing further evidence of his involvement in the crime. Telegrams were sent to law enforcement agencies across the country, and the hunt for the fugitive businessman continued, though with diminishing hope of immediate capture. For Eli and the Prestons, however, life began to settle into a new normal. The boy's nightmares, which had plagued him since the confrontation with Jenkins, gradually became less frequent. During the day, he threw himself into lessons and chores with renewed enthusiasm, as if determined to prove his worth and secure his place in the family that had risked everything to protect him. Joseph noticed the change one afternoon as they worked together in the workshop, Eli carefully polishing the brass components of a clock movement. There was a confidence in the boy's movements that hadn't been there before, a sense of belonging, rather than the constant wariness of someone expecting to be sent away at any moment. "You're getting quite skilled at this," Joseph observed watching as Eli used the tiny brush with surprising dexterity for one so young. The boy looked up, a small smile lighting his face. "I like fixing things," he said, "making them work again when they're broken." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on Joseph. He thought of the broken child who had arrived on their doorstep in the blizzard, and the healing that had taken place since, not just for Eli, but for him and Grace as well. "Some things are worth fixing," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "No matter how broken they might seem at first." Eli nodded, returning to his work with the serious concentration that characterized everything he did. But there was a lightness to him now, a cautious joy, that emerged more frequently with each passing day. A week after Jenkins's death, Judge Harrison summoned them back to the county courthouse. The formal adoption hearing was brief, but deeply moving. With no living relatives to claim him, and the fraudulent nature of Jenkins's petition exposed, Eli's placement with the Prestons was approved without reservation. "It is the finding of this court," Judge Harrison announced, "that the minor child Eli Harper shall henceforth be legally known as Eli Harper Preston, with all the rights and privileges pertaining thereto. Joseph and Grace Preston are hereby recognized as his legal parents, with full responsibility for his care, education, and upbringing." The formal language couldn't mask the judge's evident satisfaction with the outcome. As he signed the official documents, he allowed himself a rare smile. "Sometimes," he remarked to Joseph and Grace, "the law and justice align perfectly. This is one of those occasions." For Eli, the most significant moment came not in the courtroom, but afterward as they prepared to leave. Sheriff Miller approached something small wrapped in cloth, held carefully in his hand. "Found this in Jenkins's effects," he explained, unwrapping the object to reveal a piece of white fabric yellowed with age and smoke, with Eli embroidered in faded blue thread. "Thought you might want it back." The boy stared at the cloth, recognition and emotion washing over his face. He reached out slowly, taking it with reverent care. "My mother made this," he whispered. "I thought it was lost forever." "Not lost," Miller corrected gently. "Just waiting to find its way back to you, like some other things in life." Eli looked up at Joseph and Grace, standing protectively on either side of him, then back at the cherished memento of his first mother. "Thank you," he said, simply, carefully folding the cloth and placing it in his pocket close to his heart. The journey home was quiet, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts. As the familiar landscape of hills and forests passed by, Eli broke the silence with a question that caught Joseph and Grace by surprise. "Can I call you Mother and Father now?" he asked, his voice small but determined. "Officially, I mean." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and Joseph had to clear his throat several times before he could respond. "You can call us whatever feels right to you, Eli," he said finally. "We're your parents now in every way that matters, but we know you had a mother who loved you very much. We wouldn't want to take her place in your heart." Eli considered this thoughtfully. "I think she'd understand," he said, with the simple wisdom of a child. "She hid me so someone would find me and keep me safe. And you did, both of you." "Then we would be honored," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "But only when you're ready." The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. As they crested the final hill, and their cabin came into view nestled against the winter landscape, like a haven of warmth and safety, Eli leaned forward eagerly. "Home," he said the word, carrying a weight of meaning beyond its single syllable. Home. Not just a place, but a belonging. Not just shelter, but sanctuary. After years of displacement and uncertainty of being passed from hand to hand, like an unwanted parcel Eli had found where he was meant to be, with the people who had opened their door during a blizzard, and in doing so had opened their hearts as well. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, not sent, but accompanied by both Joseph and Grace, for the familiar ritual of tucking in and a story, the new parents sat by the fire hands, intertwined, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you remember what you said when he first arrived?" Joseph asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on Grace's palm. "About it being providence rather than coincidence." She nodded, her face soft in the firelight. "I believed it then, and I believe it even more now. That boy was meant to find us Joseph, just as we were meant to find him." "Twice," Joseph added, still amazed by the circular path that had brought Eli back to them 5 years after he'd first rescued him from the fire. "What are the odds of that, if not by some divine arrangement?" Grace smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "I was thinking the same thing earlier today. How many small decisions, small moments led to this? If you hadn't been delivering that clock 5 years ago, if the blizzard hadn't come when it did, if the letter hadn't had the wrong address, or if we hadn't opened the door," Joseph added softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire, the gentle creaking of the cabin settling around them. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window to settle on the already white landscape. "He still has nightmares," Grace said finally. "I hear him sometimes calling out in his sleep." Joseph nodded. "The memories of that night will fade with time, but they'll never disappear completely. All we can do is be there when he wakes, to remind him he's safe now." "And to make new memories," Grace added. "Happier ones to balance the painful ones." As if in answer to their conversation, a small sound from the hallway made them both turn. Eli stood there in his nightshirt, his dark hair tousled from sleep, the wooden horse clutched in one hand. "I had a dream," he said simply. Without a word, Grace held out her arms, and the boy came to her, climbing into her lap, as if he'd been doing so all his life. Joseph moved closer, enfolding both of them in his embrace, a circle of protection and love. "Do you want to talk about it?" Grace asked gently, stroking the child's hair. Eli shook his head. "It's gone now," he murmured, nestling closer. "Can I stay here for a while?" "As long as you want," Joseph assured him. "This is your home now. Always." As the boy's breathing slowed, his body relaxing into the safety of their embrace, Joseph and Grace exchanged a look over his head, a look that contained all the love, gratitude, and wonder of new parents, blessed with a child who had come to them not through birth, but through a storm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks and covering the scars of the past beneath a blanket of pristine white. Inside, a family forged by choice, rather than blood, held fast to one another, finding in their connection a shelter more enduring than any cabin, stronger than any storm. Spring arrived in a riot of color, the snow melting to reveal tender shoots of green pushing through the soil. The woods surrounding the Preston cabin came alive with birdsong and the scent of wildflowers, while in the small garden plot, Grace and Eli worked side by side, preparing the earth for planting. "These will be carrots," Grace explained, showing Eli how to make a shallow furrow in the dark soil. "And over there we'll plant peas. They need something to climb on, so your father will build a trellis." Eli nodded seriously, absorbing the information with his characteristic intensity. At 7, nearly 8 now, as he reminded them regularly, he approached every task as if it were of utmost importance, whether it was learning to plant vegetables or mastering the intricacies of clock repair under Joseph's patient guidance. "Can we plant flowers too?" he asked, looking up at Grace with those solemn blue eyes. "My mother, my first mother, she liked flowers. I remember there were some by our cabin." Grace's heart swelled at the simple request. It was the first time Eli had expressed interest in creating a memorial of sorts for Lillian Harper. "Of course we can," she assured him. "What kind do you remember?" Eli's brow furrowed in concentration. "Blue ones," he said after a moment, "small with lots of petals. They smelled sweet." "Forget-me-nots," Grace suggested. "They grow wild in these parts, especially near water. We could plant some along the edge of the garden." The boy nodded, pleased with this solution. She would like that, he decided. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the spring sunshine warm on their backs. From his workshop came the rhythmic sound of Joseph's saw as he crafted the promised trellis. The peaceful domesticity of the scene was a balm after the turmoil of the winter months. The investigation into Harold Whitfield's criminal activities had continued throughout the early spring, revealing a network of corruption that extended far beyond the local area. Several of his business associates had been arrested, though Whitfield himself remained at large, last reported heading west toward the territories where law enforcement was stretched thin. Sheriff Miller visited occasionally to update them on the investigation's progress and to check on Eli's well-being. The lawman had developed a genuine fondness for the boy, bringing him small gifts: a fishing hook, a carved whistle, once even a puppy that had been abandoned in town. The dog, a scruffy terrier mix Eli had named Scout, now raced around the garden, occasionally digging in freshly turned soil until gently scolded. "Sheriff Miller is coming for dinner tonight," Grace reminded Eli as they finished their planting. "We should clean up and start preparing." Eli nodded carefully, gathering the garden tools as Grace had taught him. "Will he have news about Mr. Whitfield?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Grace studied the boy's face, noting the shadow that crossed it at the mention of the man who had been connected to his mother's death. "Perhaps," she answered honestly. "But remember what we discussed. Mr. Whitfield can't hurt you now. You're safe here with us." "I know," Eli said, though something in his tone suggested the reassurance wasn't entirely believed. "It's just, as long as he's out there somewhere, it doesn't feel finished." The insight was remarkably mature for a child his age, though Grace had long since stopped being surprised by Eli's perceptiveness. Trauma had forced him to understand complexities that most children his age remained blissfully ignorant of. "Sometimes justice takes time," she said gently, "but it does come in one form or another. Remember, Mr. Jenkins?" Eli nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer for now. They returned to the cabin where Grace began preparations for dinner, while Eli changed into clean clothes. By the time Sheriff Miller arrived, the boy had regained his composure, greeting the lawman with a shy smile. "Well now, young man, you've grown at least an inch since I saw you last," Miller observed, hanging his hat by the door. "Keep that up, and you'll be taller than your father before you know it." Eli's chest puffed up slightly at this prediction, his smile widening. "Father's been teaching me to fish," he announced proudly. "I caught 3 trout last week, all by myself." "That's so." Miller looked suitably impressed. "Fine eating trout. Perhaps you'll take me along sometime, show me your technique." The easy conversation continued through dinner, Miller regaling them with tales of his early days as a lawman that had Eli wide-eyed with wonder. It was only after the meal, when Eli had been sent to feed Scout and get ready for bed, that the sheriff's expression turned serious. "We've had news of Whitfield," he said, lowering his voice so the boy wouldn't overhear. "He was spotted in Denver 2 weeks ago. Federal marshals nearly had him, but he slipped away." Joseph nodded grimly. "He can't run forever." "No," Miller agreed. But he can run for a damned long time with the money and connections he has. He hesitated, glancing toward the door to ensure Eli wasn't within earshot. There's something else. Something I haven't shared with my superiors yet, because I wanted to discuss it with you first. Grace and Joseph exchanged a worried glance. What is it? Grace asked. Miller reached into his coat, extracting a small package wrapped in oilcloth. This was found last week by a trapper working the area near where the Harper cabin stood. It had been buried under a large rock about 50 yards from the site. He unwrapped the package to reveal a metal box, tarnished and dented, but intact, its small lock broken. Joseph drew in a sharp breath, recognition immediate. The box Eli mentioned, he said softly. The one Lillian Harper hid with him under the floor. Miller nodded. I believe so. Someone must have recovered it after the fire, perhaps Jenkins himself, but couldn't open it immediately. They hid it nearby, intending to return, but something prevented them. What's inside? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff opened the box carefully. Inside lay a small leather-bound diary and several folded papers, all slightly damaged by moisture, but still legible. Lillian Harper's evidence, he confirmed. Dates, times, amounts of opium shipments, names of all involved, including detailed accounts of Whitfield's role as the operation's mastermind. And Jenkins, Joseph asked. Mentioned throughout as Whitfield's enforcer, the man who made problems disappear. Miller's expression was grim. There's more. Personal entries that suggest Lillian feared for her life long before the fire. She knew she'd discovered something dangerous, something people would kill to keep secret. Grace's hand had gone to her throat, her eyes filled with tears for the young mother who had died protecting both her child and the truth. Does Eli need to know about this? She asked. Hasn't he been through enough? Miller considered the question. Eventually, yes. When he's older, he deserves to know the full truth about his mother's courage. But for now, he shook his head. Let him be a child. Let him heal. Joseph nodded in agreement, though his expression remained troubled. What happens with this evidence now? It goes to the federal authorities, Miller said. It's enough to ensure Whitfield never shows his face in respectable society again, even if they don't manage to apprehend him immediately. His assets will be seized, his business empire dismantled. And Victoria? Grace asked, thinking of the elegant woman who had withdrawn her petition to adopt Eli, not from conscience, but from self-preservation. Miller's mouth tightened. She's already left the area, took whatever valuables she could carry, and departed on the eastbound train last week. Smart woman in her way. She saw which way the wind was blowing. They fell silent, each contemplating the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. The diary and papers in the metal box represented Lillian Harper's last testament, evidence gathered at the cost of her life, hidden in the desperate hope that someday the truth would emerge and justice would be served. Eli should have something of his mother's, Grace said suddenly. Not now, perhaps, but something to keep, something to remember her by, beyond just the cloth with his name. Miller nodded thoughtfully. There's a locket mentioned in the diary, gold with a small portrait inside. She writes of wearing it always close to her heart. He looked at Joseph. It wasn't found with her remains after the fire. Jenkins might have taken it, Joseph suggested, or it could still be there buried in the ruins. I'll have my deputies search the site again, Miller promised. More thoroughly this time. If it's there, we'll find it. From the hallway came the sound of small footsteps, and they quickly wrapped the box and its contents back in the oilcloth. Eli appeared in the doorway, now dressed in his nightshirt, Scout trotting faithfully at his heels. Time for bed, Grace said, rising to escort him. Eli nodded, but his gaze lingered on the package Miller was tucking back into his coat. Something in his expression suggested he understood more than the adults realized, though he asked no questions. "Good night, Sheriff," he said politely. "Thank you for the stories about catching outlaws." Miller smiled, the stern lines of his face softening. "You're welcome, son. Perhaps next time I visit, you can show me those fishing skills of yours." Eli nodded, pleased by the suggestion. As Grace led him to his room, Joseph and Miller exchanged a meaningful glance. The box and its contents represented the end of one chapter in Eli's life, the final piece of the puzzle that had begun with a fire, and a mother's desperate attempt to save both her child and the truth. But it was also, in its way, a beginning, the start of healing, of justice, of a legacy that would someday help Eli understand the woman who had given him life, and in the end, sacrificed her own to protect him. Later, after Miller had gone, and Eli was asleep, Joseph and Grace sat by the fire, the events of the evening settling between them like the embers slowly cooling on the hearth. "He knew," Grace said softly. "Eli, he knew that package had something to do with his mother." Joseph nodded. "He's always been perceptive, more than we give him credit for sometimes. Do you think Miller is right, that we should wait to tell him about the diary, about what his mother discovered?" Joseph considered the question carefully. I think Eli has carried burdens no child should have to bear. The memories of the fire, the years of uncertainty, the confrontation with Jenkins. If we can lighten that load even for a little while, we should." Grace nodded, understanding his reasoning. "But someday he'll need to know, to understand why his mother died, to take pride in her courage." "Someday," Joseph agreed. "When he's ready, when the knowledge will strengthen rather than wound." They fell silent, listening to the night sounds around their cabin, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of wind through new leaves, the occasional creak of settling wood. Peaceful sounds, ordinary sounds, the backdrop to a life being rebuilt day by day. "I checked on him before coming back downstairs," Grace said after a while. "He was sleeping peacefully. No nightmares." Joseph smiled, reaching for her hand. "That's progress, real progress." It was progress indeed, not just for Eli, but for all of them. The nightmares were becoming less frequent, the shadows less pervasive. In their place grew something new, hope, security, the quiet joy of belonging. A family forged, not in the conventional way, but in the crucible of shared adversity and mutual love. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and nourishing, washing away the last traces of winter's harshness. Inside, Grace and Joseph sat hand in hand, guardians of a child who had come to them through storm and fire, now peacefully sleeping under their protection. The path forward would not always be smooth. There would be challenges, setbacks, the inevitable complications of raising a child with Eli's history. But they would face them together, strengthened by the knowledge that some bonds once formed cannot be broken by any force on earth. Summer faded into autumn, the trees around the Preston cabin blazing with color before surrendering their leaves to the increasingly chill winds. Eli, now officially 8 years old, following a birthday celebration that had included the entire community, threw himself into the seasonal preparations with characteristic determination. He helped Joseph chop and stack firewood, assisted Grace in preserving the garden's bounty, and still found time for his lessons and the clock repair skills that increasingly absorbed his interest. "He has a gift for it," Joseph remarked to Grace one evening as they watched Eli bent over a particularly complex clock movement, his small fingers working with remarkable precision. "An intuitive understanding of how the pieces fit together, how the whole mechanism breathes and lives. Grace smiled, recognizing the pride in her husband's voice. Like father, like son, she observed softly. The phrase simple, though it was never failed to warm Joseph's heart. Each time Eli called him father, still somewhat shyly as if testing the word's weight and truth, he felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected blessing that had come to them through tragedy and chance. The investigation into Harold Whitfield's criminal enterprises had continued throughout the summer and early fall, revealing a network of corruption that stretched across state lines and involved several prominent figures. The evidence found in Lillian Harper's metal box had proven invaluable, leading to multiple arrests and the seizure of significant assets. Whitfield himself remained at large, though sightings had become increasingly rare, suggesting he had perhaps fled the country altogether. Sheriff Miller still visited regularly, partly to update them on the investigation, but mostly they suspected because he had grown fond of Eli and enjoyed teaching the boy wilderness skills that complemented Joseph's more technical instruction. Under the lawman's guidance, Eli had become an accomplished fisherman and was learning to track animals in the forest surrounding their home. On this particular autumn day, Miller arrived not on official business, but bearing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Something for the boy," he explained to Grace as she welcomed him inside. "Found by one of my deputies during the final search of the Harper cabin site." Grace's eyes widened in understanding. "The locket." Miller nodded, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Buried deep in what would have been the bedroom. Must have fallen through the floorboards during the fire, which is why it wasn't discovered earlier. It's damaged, of course, but the portrait inside survived." "Oh, Joseph will want to hear this," Grace said, calling her husband in from the workshop, where he and Eli had been working all morning. When they were all seated at the kitchen table, Miller unwrapped the package and carefully placed its contents before them, a gold locket tarnished and slightly misshapen from heat, its chain broken but still attached. Despite the damage, it remained recognizable as a fine piece of jewelry, suggesting Lillian Harper had once known better circumstances than the isolated cabin where she had met her end. "May I?" Joseph asked, reaching for the locket with a craftsman's appreciative eye. Miller nodded, and Joseph examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "Good quality gold," he observed. "It can be restored with some work." He found the small clasp and opened it gently to reveal two miniature portraits inside. One was of Eli as a toddler, his blue eyes and serious expression instantly recognizable despite the years that had passed. The other was of a young woman with dark hair and refined features, her smile gentle, yet somehow sad. "Lillian," Grace breathed, leaning closer to see. The resemblance to Eli was unmistakable. The same shapely mouth, the same determined set to the chin. Joseph studied the portrait for a long moment, his expression complex. This was the woman he had failed to save, whose screams still sometimes haunted his dreams. The woman whose son had, by some miracle or divine design, found his way back to them years later. "She was beautiful," he said finally. "She was," Miller agreed. "And brave. Braver than most men I've known." He looked toward the workshop where Eli could be heard puttering with tools. "I thought the boy should have this, a connection to his past, to the mother who loved him enough to die protecting him." Grace nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It's perfect, but," she hesitated, "is he ready? Will it bring back painful memories?" "He's stronger than you think," Joseph said gently. "And he remembers so little of her now. This might help him hold on to what memories remain." Miller rose, preparing to leave. "I'll let you decide when and how to give it to him. You know the boy best." After the sheriff had gone, Joseph and Grace discussed how to present the locket to Eli. Finally, they decided that Joseph should craft a special box for it, something beautiful and enduring, a fitting container for such a precious memento. Over the next few days, Joseph worked in secret during the hours when Eli was occupied with lessons or chores. He selected the finest piece of cherry wood from his stores, a rich reddish timber that would darken and deepen with age. With painstaking care, he fashioned a small box with dovetail joints lining the interior with soft velvet and adding a simple but elegant brass clasp. On the lid, he inlaid a design in lighter maple wood, a forget-me-not flower symbol of remembrance, and the bloom Eli had associated with his mother. Around the edge, he carefully carved a series of interlocking gears, a tribute to the boy's growing passion for clockwork and precision. As a final touch, he created a secret compartment in the bottom of the box, accessible only if one knew to press the center of one specific gear in the decorative border. Here, when Eli was older, they could place Lillian's diary and the other documents that told the full story of her courage and sacrifice. The evening he completed the box, Joseph called Eli into the workshop. The boy came willingly, always eager for time in this space that had become their shared sanctuary. He found Joseph seated at his workbench, the completed box before him, Grace standing quietly by the window. "What's that?" Eli asked, curiosity evident in his voice as he approached. Joseph smiled, gesturing for him to come closer. "Something I made for you. Something special." Eli examined the box with appreciative eyes, running his fingers over the inlaid flower and carved gears. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. "Is it for my clock parts?" Joseph exchanged a glance with Grace before answering. "It could be someday, but it was made for something else. Something that belongs to you by right." He opened the box carefully to reveal the locket, now cleaned and partially restored. The chain had been repaired, the gold polished to reveal its original luster. Though signs of damage remained, slight warping from the heat of the fire, a small dent in one side, it was now a thing of beauty once more. Eli stared at it, uncomprehending at first. Then, hesitantly, he reached out to touch it with one finger, as if afraid it might disappear. "This belonged to your mother," Grace said gently, moving to stand beside him. "Your first mother, Lillian. Sheriff Miller's deputies found it at the site of your old cabin." Understanding dawned in Eli's eyes. He picked up the locket with reverent care, holding it in his palm, as if weighing not just its physical presence, but all it represented. "Can I open it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Joseph encouraged. "It's yours." With trembling fingers, Eli worked the small clasp. When the locket opened to reveal the portraits inside, his breath caught audibly. For a long moment, he simply stared at the images, his expression a complex mixture of recognition, grief, and wonder. "That's her," he said finally. "My mother." His finger hovered over the portrait, not quite touching it. "And that's me, when I was little." "Yes," Grace confirmed, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You were about 2 years old in that picture, we think." Eli continued to study the portraits, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to reconcile these images with his fragmented memories. "I remember her voice," he said slowly, "and how she smelled, like oranges and something else, something sweet, and she used to sing to me at night." "The angel's song," Joseph supplied gently. Eli nodded, his eyes still fixed on the locket. "She loved me," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact, spoken with the simple certainty of a child who knew, despite everything, that he had been cherished. "Yes," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "She loved you very much, enough to protect you at any cost." Eli closed the locket carefully and placed it back in the box, his movements deliberate and respectful. Then he looked up at Joseph and Grace, his blue eyes, so like his mother's in the portrait, bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said simply, "for this, and for—" He struggled to find the words, his young mind grappling with concepts and emotions that would challenge even an adult. "For everything." Joseph knelt to bring himself to the boy's level, placing his hands on Eli's shoulders. "You don't need to thank us, son. You're our gift. The one we never expected, but needed more than we knew." Eli studied his face for a moment, then stepped forward into Joseph's embrace, his small arms wrapping tightly around the man's neck. Over the boy's shoulder, Joseph met Grace's gaze, seeing in her eyes the same overwhelming gratitude and love that filled his own heart. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, the special box with its precious contents placed carefully on the shelf beside his bed, Joseph and Grace stood in the doorway of his room, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest in sleep. "Do you think it was the right decision?" Grace whispered, "giving him the locket now?" Joseph nodded his arm around her waist. Yes, he needed this connection to her to know she was real and that she loved him. The rest, the full truth about why she died, that can wait until he's older. They withdrew quietly, leaving Eli to his dreams. As they prepared for their own rest, Joseph found himself thinking of the intricate workings of the clocks he crafted and repaired. Each piece had its purpose, its place in the greater mechanism. Remove one gear, one spring, and the entire clock failed to function as intended. Their family was like that, he reflected. Each of them damaged in some way by life's hardships, yet finding in their connection to one another a new purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. Eli was the piece that had been missing from their lives, the one that had allowed healing to begin after years of grief and emptiness. Outside, the autumn wind sang through the trees, carrying the first hints of the winter to come. Inside, warmed by the banked fire and the deeper heat of belonging, the Preston family slept peacefully, their lives now synchronized in a harmony that transcended blood ties, a connection forged through choice, courage, and unwavering love. The seasons turned as they always did: winter, yielding reluctantly to spring, then summer, then autumn once more. With each passing month, the memories of that terrible night when Jenkins had threatened their family faded a little further into the past, though they never disappeared entirely. Like the faint scar on Grace's temple where she had struck the bed frame during the struggle, some marks remained as permanent reminders of what they had survived together. Eli continued to thrive under the Prestons' care, growing taller and stronger, his natural intelligence flourishing with education and encouragement. His gift for mechanical work developed steadily under Joseph's guidance, while Grace nurtured his emerging talents in mathematics and literature. By his 9th birthday, he was helping Joseph with increasingly complex clock repairs, his small hands particularly suited to the delicate work of adjusting tiny mechanisms. The locket remained one of his most treasured possessions, kept in the special box Joseph had crafted. Often, in quiet moments, Grace would find him studying the portrait of his mother, his expression thoughtful as he tried to reconcile the beautiful young woman in the image with his fragmented memories of her. "She looked happy here," he observed one evening as Grace passed his room and found him sitting cross-legged on his bed, the open locket in his hands. "But Sheriff Miller said she was afraid, hiding from bad men." Grace paused in the doorway, recognizing the invitation to conversation in his words. "People can be many things at once," she said, settling beside him on the bed. "Happy in some moments, afraid in others. Your mother found joy in you even when she was worried about other things." Eli nodded, seeming to accept this explanation. "Do you think Mr. Whitfield will ever be caught?" he asked, changing direction with the abruptness typical of children. The question caught Grace by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Despite their efforts to shield him from the ongoing investigation, Eli absorbed information like a sponge, piecing together fragments of adult conversations with his own memories and observations. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Sheriff Miller and the federal marshals are still looking for him. But he's had a long time to hide, to create a new identity, perhaps." Eli considered this, his brow furrowed in the way it always was when he was processing something difficult. "I used to be afraid he'd come for me like Mr. Jenkins did," he admitted. "But not anymore." "What changed?" Grace asked gently. The boy looked up at her, his blue eyes clear and direct. "I realized he can't take me away from you and Father. Not really. Even if he came here, even if something happened." He swallowed hard, then continued with quiet determination. "I'd still be your son. And Lillian's son, too. That can't be taken away." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple wisdom in his words. Wordlessly, she pulled him close, her heart full to bursting with love for this remarkable child who had survived so much and emerged not bitter or broken, but thoughtful and resilient. "You're right," she whispered into his dark hair. "Nothing can change that, not ever." The following spring brought news that Harold Whitfield had been found dead in a small coastal town in Mexico, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Sheriff Miller delivered the information personally, arriving unannounced one afternoon as Joseph and Eli worked in the garden, preparing the soil for planting. "They're sure it's him?" Joseph asked as they sat at the kitchen table, Eli having been sent to fetch water from the well to give the adults privacy for their discussion. Miller nodded, accepting the coffee Grace offered. "Dental records confirm it. And he had papers on him. False identity, but unmistakably his handwriting according to experts who examined it." "So it's over," Grace said, relief evident in her voice. "Truly over." "The investigation, yes," Miller agreed. "Though the effects of what he did, the lives he damaged, the corruption he spread, those will linger for years to come." Joseph glanced toward the window, watching Eli as he carefully carried the water bucket back toward the house. "Does the boy need to know?" Miller considered this. "Not the details, perhaps. But knowing the man who was ultimately responsible for his mother's death is no longer a threat. Yes, I think that might bring him some peace." They told Eli that evening, keeping the explanation simple and age-appropriate. The boy received the news with a solemnity that seemed beyond his years, asking few questions but clearly processing the information in his own way. Later, as Joseph passed Eli's partially open door, he noticed the boy kneeling beside his bed, head bowed in prayer. Not wanting to intrude on the private moment, Joseph began to withdraw, but Eli sensed his presence and looked up. "I was praying for my mother," he explained quietly. "And for Mr. Whitfield, too." Joseph blinked in surprise. "For Whitfield?" Eli nodded, his expression serious. "Pastor Bennett says we should pray for our enemies. And I thought my mother would want me to forgive him, even though what he did was terrible." Joseph felt a surge of pride and humility at the child's capacity for compassion. That's very generous of you, Eli. Not everyone could find that forgiveness in their heart." The boy shrugged slightly. "It doesn't mean I'm not still angry sometimes, but holding on to the anger doesn't help anyone. It just makes me feel bad inside." Joseph crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, regarding his son with newfound appreciation. "You're a remarkable young man, Eli Preston. Your mother, both your mothers, would be very proud of you." Eli smiled at that, the simple joy in his expression washing away the momentary solemnity. "Father, can we go fishing tomorrow?" Sheriff Miller showed me a new spot by the big bend in the river. He says the trout there are as big as your arm." Joseph laughed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "I suspect the sheriff might be exaggerating a bit, but yes, we can certainly try our luck there." The simple exchange, the easy shift from profound spiritual matters to boyish enthusiasm for fishing, reassured Joseph that despite all he had endured, Eli was growing into a healthy, well-adjusted child. There would always be shadows in his past memories that might resurface unexpectedly, but they hadn't defined him or limited his capacity for joy and normal development. That summer marked 3 years since Eli had arrived at their door during the blizzard. To celebrate, they planned a special outing, a trip to the county fair, where Eli could ride the carousel sample treats like cotton candy and caramel apples, and see the various exhibitions of livestock and handicrafts. The day was perfect warm, but not oppressively hot. The sky a brilliant blue dotted with occasional fluffy white clouds. Eli's excitement was palpable as they arrived at the fairgrounds, his eyes wide at the colorful tents, the music from the bandstand, the crowds of people enjoying the festivities. "Can we see everything?" he asked eagerly, practically bouncing on his toes as they passed through the entrance gates. "We'll certainly try," Joseph promised, amused by the boy's enthusiasm. They wandered through the agricultural exhibits, admiring prize-winning vegetables and livestock. Eli was particularly fascinated by the mechanical displays, steam engines, new farming equipment, and a special exhibit on modern timepieces that Joseph examined with professional interest. At midday, they found a shady spot to enjoy the picnic lunch. Grace had packed, watching as performers on the nearby stage entertained the crowd with juggling and acrobatics. Eli, usually so contained, laughed openly at the antics of a clown who pulled improbable objects from his pockets and pretended to argue with a small, trained dog. "This is the best day ever," he declared, his face sticky with cotton candy eyes, bright with excitement. Grace smiled, wiping a smudge of sugar from his cheek with her handkerchief. "I'm glad you're enjoying yourself, dear heart." As the afternoon progressed, they made their way to the carousel. Eli had never ridden one before, and he approached the colorful, music-playing contraption with a mixture of eagerness and trepidation. Joseph purchased tickets, and they helped him select a horse, a magnificent black stallion with a flowing mane and fiery eyes. "Hold on tight," Joseph instructed, making sure Eli was securely seated before stepping back to join Grace on the sidelines. The music swelled, the carousel began to turn, and Eli's face transformed with pure delight as his horse rose and fell in rhythm with the tune. Around and around he went, waving each time he passed his parents, his laughter carrying over the mechanical organ's cheerful melody. Grace slipped her hand into Joseph's, leaning against his shoulder, as they watched their son enjoying this simple childhood pleasure, something he might never have experienced if fate hadn't brought him to their door that winter night. "Look at him," she murmured. "So happy, so carefree. Sometimes I forget all he's been through." Joseph squeezed her hand. "That's as it should be. The past is part of him, but it doesn't define him, not anymore." As the carousel slowed and finally stopped, Eli dismounted with reluctance, immediately asking if he could ride again. Joseph laughed and purchased another ticket, watching as the boy scrambled back onto his chosen steed with undiminished enthusiasm. It was during this second ride, as the carousel turned and the music played, that Joseph noticed a woman standing nearby watching Eli with an intensity that immediately put him on alert. She was well-dressed, middle-aged, with a familiar quality to her features that he couldn't immediately place. "Joseph," Grace whispered, having noticed the woman as well. "Isn't that—" Before she could finish, the woman approached them, her expression uncertain but determined. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston," she said, her voice cultured and slightly tremulous. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. My name is Martha Sullivan. I worked at the St. Agnes Orphanage in Riverstone when Eli was first brought there. Joseph tensed instinctively, moving closer to Grace. After everything they had endured to keep Eli safe, any unexpected connection to his past triggered immediate caution. "What do you want with our son?" he asked, perhaps more sharply than he'd intended. Martha Sullivan raised her hands slightly, a placating gesture. "Nothing sinister, I assure you. I've been following the case, the investigation into Harold Whitfield and Gregory Jenkins. When I learned Eli had found a permanent home with you, I wanted to see for myself that he was well, happy." Grace studied the woman's face, looking for any sign of deception. "You knew him at the orphanage." Martha nodded, her gaze returning to Eli as he circled past on the carousel, still laughing with unrestrained joy. "I was there when Joseph brought him in after the fire. Such a solemn little thing, hardly speaking, clutching that piece of cloth with his name on it like it was the only real thing in the world." Her description aligned with Joseph's memories of that night, lending credibility to her claim. "You cared for him?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "As best I could," Martha confirmed. "But an orphanage is no place for a child to grow up, especially one who had experienced such trauma. I tried to find him a good placement, but," she sighed, "the system is flawed. Children get lost in it, shuffled from place to place." "How did he end up in Pinewood?" Grace asked the question that had lingered in her mind for months. Martha's expression shifted, a mixture of guilt and defiance crossing her features. "That was my doing in a way. When I learned the Whitfields were seeking to adopt a child, alarm bells rang immediately. I knew of Harold Whitfield's connection to Lillian Harper. Rumors circulated even then about the circumstances of her death." She paused, watching as the carousel began to slow once more. "When the Pinewood Agency contacted St. Agnes about potential children for placement with the Whitfields, I deliberately misdirected certain documents. Made sure Eli's file would not be among those considered." Joseph and Grace exchanged a startled glance. "You were protecting him," Grace realized. Martha nodded. "I couldn't prove anything against Whitfield, but I knew in my heart he was dangerous. When I later heard that Eli had been placed with another family, the Prestons, I hoped it was for the best, though I worried about the coincidence." She looked directly at Joseph. "I never knew you were the same man who had rescued him from the fire. That seems providential." The carousel had stopped completely now, and Eli was making his way toward them, his face flushed with excitement. He pulled up short when he noticed the stranger conversing with his parents, wariness instantly replacing his carefree expression. "It's all right, Eli," Grace reassured him, extending a hand, which he took immediately, pressing close to her side. "This is Miss Sullivan. She knew you when you were very small at the orphanage after the fire." Eli regarded the woman with cautious curiosity. "I don't remember," he admitted. Martha smiled gently. "You wouldn't. You were so young, and you were only with us for a short time before being placed with your first foster family." She hesitated, then reached into her handbag, extracting a small paper packet. "I've kept this for you all these years. I always hoped I might have a chance to return it." She held out the packet, and after a glance at Joseph for permission, Eli accepted it. Inside was a small carved wooden horse, crude but recognizable, its paint chipped and faded with age. "You arrived at St. Agnes with this in your pocket," Martha explained. "It was the only toy you had. You carried it everywhere, though you never played with it. Just held it as if it connected you to something you'd lost." Eli stared at the small horse, turning it over in his palm. "I don't remember this either," he said softly. "Your mother might have given it to you," Martha suggested. "A keepsake, something to comfort you." Eli looked up at Joseph and Grace, his expression uncertain, seeking guidance on how to respond to this unexpected link to his past. Joseph placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you, Miss Sullivan," he said sincerely, "for keeping this safe for Eli all these years, and for trying to protect him even when you couldn't be sure where he would end up." Martha nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've worried about him often, wondered if he found happiness, if he was loved as he deserves to be." She looked at Eli directly. "Seeing you today, the joy in your face as you rode that carousel, it eases my heart tremendously." Eli, ever perceptive, seemed to understand the significance of the moment. He straightened slightly, his natural politeness asserting itself. "Thank you for the horse," he said, "and for remembering me." Martha smiled, clearly touched by his response. "You were always a special child, Eli, different from the others, more thoughtful, more observant. I'm not surprised you've grown into such a fine young man." With that, she bid them goodbye, disappearing into the crowd as suddenly as she had appeared. Eli watched her go, the wooden horse still clutched in his hand, his expression thoughtful. "Are you all right?" Grace asked, kneeling to his level. Eli nodded slowly. "Yes, it's just strange, knowing there are people who knew me before when I was too little to remember them." Joseph understood the sentiment. Eli's early years were largely a mystery to him, a time of fragmented memories and lost connections. Each new piece of information, each recovered artifact, like the wooden horse or the locket, helped him construct a more complete picture of his origins. "Would you like to try some of those caramel apples now?" Joseph suggested, sensing the boy needed a return to the simple pleasures of the day after this unexpected encounter. Eli's face brightened. "Yes, please." As they made their way toward the food vendors, Eli slipped the wooden horse into his pocket, alongside the small pocket watch Joseph had given him for his last birthday. Past and present carried together, symbols of the journey that had brought him from that burning cabin to this moment, this family, this life. That night, as they prepared for bed in the small room they had rented above the town's general store, the fare being too far from their cabin for a comfortable return journey after dark, Eli sat cross-legged on his cot, examining the wooden horse in the lamplight. "Do you think my mother gave this to me?" he asked, looking up at Grace, who was brushing her hair by the small mirror. "It seems likely," she answered thoughtfully. "Miss Sullivan said you had it with you when you arrived at the orphanage, and Joseph doesn't recall seeing it when he rescued you from the fire." Eli turned the small toy over in his hands, running his finger along a rough edge where the wood had splintered slightly. "I wish I could remember more about her," he said softly. "About my life before the fire." Joseph, who had been reading by the window, set his book aside and moved to sit beside the boy. "Memory is a strange thing, Eli. Sometimes it protects us by hiding what might be too painful to recall. Other times it surprises us by bringing back moments we thought were lost forever." "Like when I remembered Mr. Jenkins's voice?" Eli asked. Joseph nodded. "Exactly like that. The important memories, the ones that truly matter, have a way of finding their way back when we need them." Eli considered this, his young face serious in the warm glow of the lamp. "I think," he began hesitantly, "I think I remember my mother singing to me. Not just the angel's song, but other songs too, and stories. She told me stories about brave knights and dragons." Grace moved to join them, settling on Eli's other side. "That's a beautiful memory to have," she said gently. "A mother singing, telling stories. Those are precious gifts." Eli nodded carefully, placing the wooden horse on the small table beside his cot, next to the pocket watch Joseph had given him. "I have two mothers," he said matter-of-factly. Lillian, who gave me life and saved me from the fire. And you, Mother, who saved me from the blizzard and from being alone. The simple statement delivered with a child's straightforward perception brought tears to Grace's eyes. She embraced Eli, holding him close as Joseph's arm encircled them both. "And you have us both forever," she promised. "No matter what." As Eli drifted toward sleep that night, Grace and Joseph conversed quietly by the window, watching the fairgrounds in the distance, still illuminated by lanterns, though the festivities had ended for the day. "Meeting Miss Sullivan was unexpected," Grace observed. "But I'm glad Eli has another connection to his past, another piece of the puzzle." Joseph nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he looked out at the twinkling lights. "Someday, we'll need to tell him everything. About Whitfield, about the evidence his mother gathered, about why she died. But not yet. For now, let him have this, the simple joy of a day at the fair, the comfort of knowing he was loved from the beginning." Grace leaned against his shoulder, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected gift that had come to them through tragedy and chance, the child who had brought light back into their lives after years of darkness. "He'll be ready when the time comes," she said confidently. "He's stronger than we sometimes remember." Outside, a shooting star streaked across the night sky, a brief, brilliant flash that illuminated the world below for just an instant before fading. Inside, in the warm glow of the lamp, Eli slept peacefully, the wooden horse and pocket watch standing sentinel beside him, symbols of the past that had shaped him and the future that awaited him, secure in the love of the family he had found in the storm. The end.